Good morning and welcome to Understanding Systemic Racism in Canada, Concepts and Data. My name is Tasha Carradine. I am very pleased to be your co-host for this event. We'll be examining the extremely important issues of discrimination, inequality, and systemic racism in our country. I am a lecturer at the Max Bell School of Public Policy at McGill University and a principal at the consulting firm of Navigator.
Good morning. My name is Mohammed Musa. I'm also thrilled to be co-hosting this event. I am the Program Officer for Social Sciences, Humanities and Youth with the Canadian Commission for UNESCO.
Before we get going, we have a bit of housekeeping, of course. We're very pleased this time to be offering simultaneous interpretation in English and French. To hear simultaneous interpretation, please go to the webinar control bar at the bottom of your screen. You'll see there an interpretation option that looks like a globe. Once you click on this option, you can choose the language that you want to hear. Pour entendre l'interprétation simultanée, veuillez s'il vous plaît naviguer en bas de votre écran, le barreau du contrôle du webinaire, et vous verrez une petite option interprétation dans la forme d'un globe. Si vous cliquez dessus, vous pouvez choisir la langue de votre choix. Si la langue de l'orateur est anglais, l'interprète traduirait en français, évidemment, dans la chaîne française. If the language that you hear is French, it will be translated into English in the English channel. Got one more housekeeping measure, and this is, of course, very important. We're thrilled so many of you are joining us on the web today. And we encourage you to be social and let people know what you're hearing. We got a couple of hashtags. One is racism data, and the other is, of course, at Canadian Studies for the Association of Canadian Studies, which is organizing part of this event.
Absolutely. And this webinar and really this project has been a real joint collaboration between the Canadian Commission for UNESCO and the Association for Canadian Studies. So we'd like to thank everyone at the Canadian Commission for UNESCO and the Association for their generous support of this conference. Nous tenons à remercier la Commission canadienne pour l'UNESCO pour son généreux soutien à cette conférence ainsi que l'Association des études canadiennes. We would also like to announce that in partnership with the Canadian Commission for UNESCO, the Association for Canadian Studies is launching the second volume of a two-part special issue of Canadian Diversity magazine to mark the International Decade for People of African Descent during this online conference exploring systemic racism. Ce numéro examine le rôle vital de la célébration de la riche histoire des personnes d'ascendance africaine, leur rôle dans la réalisation des changements importants, les mécanismes du racisme systémique, les conditions préalables à la guérison, les questions d'identité et d'intersectionnalité et comprend des œuvres d'art d'artistes afro-canadiens. And exciting news that everyone who signed up for today's event will also be receiving a digital copy of those editions. This is a joint collaboration, as I mentioned before, between the Association Canadian Studies and the Canadian Commission for UNESCO. But we'd also like to give a shout out to some of our other partners, including the Federation of Black Canadians and all of our other partners, including the Michael Jean Foundation and all of our contributors for their great work in making this publication possible. Special thanks also to Ms. Dahabo Ahmed Omer, the chair of the Federation of Black Canadians, for her contribution to the second edition of this publication and for her presence on a panel here today.
We'd also like to give a special thank you to one of the other contributors to this publication, and that is the Right Honourable Michael Jean, Canada's first Governor-General and Commander-in-Chief of African Descent. Merci beaucoup, Madame Jean, pour votre contribution à cette publication et aussi pour votre participation aujourd'hui, parce qu'on comprend que vous êtes parmi plus de 1000 personnes qui sont en ligne, je pense même 1600 qui sont enregistrées pour cet événement. Alors, merci d'y être là. Not only is Madame Jean online with us now, but she will also be headlining an all-star event that the Association for Canadian Studies is hosting on June 29th from 11 to 4 on the issue of diversity and what it means to be Canadian. Stories of Hope will feature Madame Jean, as well as the voices of a diverse group of amazing Canadians, including musicians Jan Arden and Tyler Shaw, Olympic runner Mohamed Ahmed, the grandniece of Louis Riel, Jean Théier, former Canadian star George Larac, and spoken word poet Desiree McKenzie. We hope you can join us for that amazing event next week, and you can sign up on the website of the Association for Canadian Studies or on their Facebook page.
So let's now turn to today's conference. Just a bit about the event. So this event will be divided into three parts. We will be having an opening speaker and then 2 panels, all of which will be taking questions from the audience through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So we just ask kindly that you use the Q&A feature and not the chat feature for any questions that you might have, and we definitely encourage those. Donc, nous avons 2 discours d'ouverture et ensuite 2 panels. Après tout, nous prendrons les questions dans la fonction Q&A sur votre écran.
It's now my pleasure to introduce our introductory speaker. Peter Flegel is the director of the Anti-Racism Secretariat at Canadian Heritage. Peter has 10 years of experience working through a variety of local, national, and international NGOs to advance the rights of racialized and LGBTQ minorities and other oppressed peoples. He worked for the Right Honorable Michaël Jean when he created and implemented a youth, arts, and community engagement program across Canada, Europe, Central America, and Africa. Il est aussi pianiste de formation classique, chanteur, auteur-compositeur et producteur de la genre de gospel et R&B. Monsieur Flegel a travaillé avec des grands comme Michael Bolton, Noah Forty-Shabib, Chris de Burgh et Paul Anka, tout en dirigeant des chorales de gospel et en écrivant pour des artistes comme la sensation pop québécoise Jacinthe et Jardin. Peter Flegel, the stage is yours.
Yes, OK. Donc, merci aux organisateurs. Merci pour l'invitation de m'adresser à vous aujourd'hui. Puis je voudrais également féliciter les organisateurs pour avoir le mérite de convoquer cette session, cette conférence très importante qui est d'actualité. Je voudrais tout d'abord commencer en reconnaissant que nous nous trouvons tous, partout où nous sommes, sur des terres autochtones, plusieurs d'entre eux qui n'ont pas été cédés. Et ceci fait partie de notre devoir de mémoire, mais également de réconciliation, de toujours reconnaître la part et notre responsabilité vis-à-vis des peuples autochtones, surtout à la lumière des pensionnats indiens qui ont été mis sur pied à l'échelle du pays au Canada. And this responsibility to, I guess it's a call to accountability and atonement, flows from many things, including the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, but also from the calls to justice from the final report of the National Inquiry into Missing Indigenous Women and Girls. Key here is the notion that in order to combat systemic racism effectively, we need to understand its roots, its origins, and the extent to which it permeates our institutions. And that root is inextricably linked to a long colonial history of white supremacist violence, which saw Indigenous lands dispossessed, the slavery, enslavement of Indigenous peoples, and of course, more recently, the Indian residential schools. So fighting systemic racism also requires understanding its full breadth, which includes anti-Black racism, which taints it, and it is also related to a long 400 years of history in this country, which also includes slavery, as Black and Indigenous peoples were enslaved on this land. Yes, there was the emancipation, but following emancipation was a de facto racial segregation, which then was transformed 80 years ago into legalized racial segregation, as we are marking this year the 80th anniversary of the Fred Christie case, which saw the Supreme Court of Canada legalize, in other words, provide the constitutional stamp to racial segregation in this country. And then, of course, we cannot forget racism against East Asian and Asian peoples in general. Of course, there's the head tax and Japanese internment. There's some examples of the long history of white supremacy, of racial segregation, which informs the systemic discrimination and racism, which also is colored by Islamophobia and its anti-Semitism that is reflected today. So as we obviously take stock of systemic racism, we realize that it has become much more obvious and much more evident today. And this is due to, I think, two considerations. One being, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic, which, of course, affected Canadians across the country. But what we started to see, despite having limited data at our disposal, was that it was having a disproportionate effect on racialized communities, religious minorities, and Indigenous peoples across the country. And this is despite, as we say, the limited availability of disaggregated data, which is an issue of contention and one in which advocates across the country are calling for action to help resolve. And that has been colored by, for example, as we've seen very recently, a survey demonstrating that East Asian Canadians and Chinese Canadians particularly have been disproportionately affected by racist acts and gestures of hate, whether in the streets or online. And this is something that we're hearing directly from stakeholders also across the country. We're hearing about the evidence of over surveillance of Black and Indigenous communities. And the list really goes on in the ways in which the COVID pandemic has laid bare some of the clear and something that many of us already knew prior to COVID-19, that there was stark social and economic cleavages which have a racial color in our country, and that much needs to be done to address them effectively. And then, of course, over the last few weeks, where the really traumatic images of George Floyd being asphyxiated in the United States by law enforcement officers, but also here in Canada, we have seen through videos and reports from community members of really problematic and really disturbing cases of I guess what has been deemed police brutality and racial profiling, and really unfortunate attacks on Indigenous, Black, and South Asian peoples across the country. So these two kind of large phenomena have really demonstrated to Canadians at large that Canada, despite being a champion of multiculturalism and diversity and inclusion, still has a long way to go to addressing the systemic racism that still continues to affect our country. And so we've heard, among other things, calls to defund the police, which is really bringing many of us to have a very necessary and important reflection on what our social priorities are. Where should we be investing? What are some of the root causes of the racial inequities that we are seeing and witnessing in our country? And what are the most effective and the most appropriate equitable ways to address them? And obviously for some, this conversation is uncomfortable, but it is fundamentally a necessary one for us to rectify some of the injustices and racial inequities that exist in our country. So obviously the debate is not over. The conversation continues, but it's one that is one very important, and that we obviously will be continuing on. And so this has a particular import for us at the Anti-Racism Secretariat, because our mandate flows from Canada's anti-racism strategy, which was developed for 2019 to 2022. And a fundamental cross-cutting principle of that strategy is the notion that not only does systemic racism exist in Canada, but it also pervades our institutions, and that it is a responsibility of the government to work with community really to eradicate systemic racism. And so the strategy, the objective is really to create a foundation for further federal action against systemic racism, basically on using three pillars. And one, which is the notion of government leadership. In other words, if the federal government is going to be active in fighting racism and systemic racism, it needs to lead by example and clean up its backyard. And so that's one of the responsibilities of the Secretariat, is to lead an internal, coordinated, whole of government approach to combating systemic racism, working with federal departments and institutions across the board and other orders of government. The second pillar is empowering communities. And so that the notion that the expertise and knowledge in terms of addressing and resolving systemic racism lies with those who are most directly affected. And so we need to provide adequate tools and resources to the community so that they can be effective in this area. And so that's through, among other things, our Anti-Racism Action Program and others that we are looking and will be funding organizations. And lastly, but not least, is the idea of raising awareness. And so as this understanding that there's still, unfortunately, a limited understanding of the extent to which racism has a long history in Canada, and that it's related to colonization, white supremacy, and that in order to be effective in combating systemic racism, Canadians need to understand the history and its contemporary impact today. And so this idea of two things, using a public awareness campaign to sensitize and mobilize Canadians around anti-racism, but equally to make disaggregated data more available to Canadians across the country. But really, for the Anti-Racism Secretariat to be effective in playing this whole of government coordinated role, we really need to listen to you. We need to depend and benefit from your expertise, but also bring you right into the core the halls of the federal government, so that you are ensuring that our policies, our programs, and services are adequately addressing issues facing racialized communities, religious minorities, and Indigenous peoples, that systemic barriers are being removed, and that new initiatives that are responsive and reflected to the needs are actually being developed. And so this is why we're really happy to be with you today to listen to some really fascinating speakers and panelists, which will really help us as we move forward on carrying forward our mandate in terms of addressing and combating systemic racism within government and collaborating with communities to address it within society at large. So, sur ce, je voudrais encore vous remercier et donc place au débat, place à la discussion. Merci.
Thank you so much, Peter, for placing us in this conversation and orienting our further discussion on this topic. That was fantastic. Un grand merci. And so without further ado, we will take this time to jump into our first panel, which will be the concept section, to discuss concepts around the issues of systemic racism. But before we do this, just a couple of housekeeping notes. So I'd like to draw everyone's attention to some polling questions, which you should see in a few short moments. A poll popping up on your screen, I believe that's the one. And so these are questions related to how we can address systemic racism. And while you are engaging with the conference, the Association for Canadian Studies would appreciate if you could take a few moments just to respond to these questions. Your responses will remain anonymous and will help inform the changes that we need to see. So jumping into our first panel, I'm just going to present our chair for this panel. So to moderate this panel, we have with us Dr. June Francis. Dr. Francis is an associate professor of marketing at the Beatty School of Business at Simon Fraser University. She is the co-founder of the Co-Laboratorio project that works to strengthen cross-sector collaboration, learning, and innovation for more inclusive, resilient solutions in governance, policies, and industry practice. She is also director of the Institute for Diaspora Research and Engagement at Simon Fraser University. The Institute's mandate is to strengthen the links between scholarly research, policy, and practice related to multicultural and diaspora communities and the role in building innovative, sustainable, and inclusive initiatives. June has won awards for both service and teaching excellence. Et donc, la Dr. Francis est actuellement coprésidente de la Hogan's Alley Society, qui se consacre à la réalisation des objectifs stratégiques identifiés dans le plan de région de Northeast Falls Creek pour la communauté noire et pour mission de faire progresser le bien-être social, politique, économique et culturel des personnes d'ascendance africaine par la livraison des logements et de programmes. Originaire de la Jamaïque, June a obtenu son baccalauréat à l'Université des Antilles et ensuite déménagé au Canada, où elle a obtenu son MBA à l'Université York. June a terminé son doctorat aux États-Unis à l'Université de Washington et a obtenu un LLB du Royaume-Uni au BPP School of Law. So June, the floor is yours. À vous la parole.
I take it that I had somehow I missed the volume dropped.
Sorry, June. The floor is yours. So over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone for joining our panel today. We have quite an interesting panel that will be discussing these issues. And I will simply introduce them. We've decided on a dialogue format, so the panel will be responding to questions. And just wanted to make that clear. And then we'll open it up, questions by me, and then we'll open it up to the floor. So a survey by Abacus Data for City News found that 61% of Canadians say they're certain or pretty certain that systemic racism in Canada is serious. We agree. And I think you'll find that our panel agrees with this. And so one of the things we'd like to do now is to get into some discussions about the real core issues that were raised by Peter. So thank you very much for that introduction, because you highlighted some of the issues that signaled to Canadians recently why systemic racism is so transparent now to most Canadians. Of course, this has been transparent to those of us who have experienced at the other end of experiencing this racism. I'd like to introduce our panel now. The three panelists bring a collective wealth of experience and insights to the topics and concepts of systemic racism. We know that in a report by the United Nations, they reminded us that Canada's history of enslavement with respect to the Black community, racial segregation, and marginalization of African Canadians has left a legacy of anti-Black racism that has had deleterious impact on people of African descent. So we will be perhaps focusing to some extent on these specific issues in this panel today. Now, I'd like to introduce Dabo Ahmed Omer. She was previously introduced as she is the chair of the Federation of Black Canadians and Director of Operations at the Somali Center for Family Services. She's the co-founder of the Justice for Undermine Coalition, which has pushed for changes to law enforcement and the justice system since Abdi's death, following his violent arrest in central Ottawa that most of us are familiar with and remember sadly. She's also a board member of the Black Agenda Noir organization, which is a circle of united Black citizens whose goal is to cement Black presence on the national radar. She has been recipient of the notable awards over the years, including the Exceptional Service within the Public Service, the Federal Public Service, the Canada 150 Community Builder Award, the Hope Academy Community Contribution Award, and the Black History Community Leader Award, and most notably, the 100 under 40 most influential person of African descent in support of the United Nations decade. I'd also like to introduce another speaker, Dr. Anne-Marie Livingston, who is a Montreal native and is the William Lyon Mackenzie King postdoctoral fellow with the Canadian program at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard University. She earned her degree in the Department of Sociology at the now famous Johns Hopkins, always famous, but of course became more famous with its COVID map, Johns Hopkins University. She was one of the leaders of the research team of the qualitative study, which looked into racial profiling by the Montreal police. Her research interests include racial stratification, urban poverty, urban sociology, and political sociology. Finally, I'd like to introduce Linton Garner, who is the executive director of the Regional Association of West Quebecers. He is a bilingual community leader and an expert in community development, intercultural relationship, and governance development of community organization. His extensive experience acquired over 25 years in the sector has given him exposure to both administrative hands-on role in community organization, public institutions, and governance. I should say government. His board level involvement with multiple organizations and public entities has given him a sound knowledge of governance best practices and organizational development. So I'd like to start this session, and I'd like you to join me in welcoming this incredible panel. And I ask them now to unmute their buttons and to also unmute their videos as we get into this conversation. We thought it best to have it as a conversational approach. And so I will start now by directing my first question to all the panelists, but I will start with Dabo. As was mentioned before, we watched in horror as we saw systemic racism unveil itself, show itself up in the COVID-19 pandemic, and also the events of police brutality and racism. And so I asked the panel, perhaps now, to address this question. What do these events reveal to us about systemic racism in Canada? And I will start with you, Dabo.
Thank you so much, June. And thank you to the organizers for bringing all of these amazing panelists together. I'm honored to be amongst all of you. I think it's a really important conversation, and I'm excited to sort of get into this. June, you asked a really good question. I think that we are in a place now that we are in one country and we're dealing with two pandemics, COVID-19 and anti-Black racism. You know, it's sad, but I think that we, being Black right now, and for a long time, to be honest, has been considered illegal. And that's a strong statement. But I think once we get into this conversation, you'll see the way that systemic and structural institutions and how they've impacted Black communities in a disproportionately negative way. And so I think that we are past the time of colorblindness. I think we are past the time of you know, telling ourselves that we need to do more research and we need to you know, do more studies and consultations. I think it's time to you know, in other terms, legalize our Blackness. And so when we saw that video of George Floyd in the midst of this pandemic, I mean, it's sad, but it took the burning down of an entire city in order for them to just arrest one police officer. And it's sad that it got to that point in order for institutions to act. I think that COVID-19 has only heightened and really highlighted anti-Black racism. We know that Black Canadians make up 3% of the general population or represent over 7% of federal prison population. We also know that specifically Black citizens in Toronto are carded, which means randomly stopped by police without evidence and arbitrarily at up to 10 times the rate of white citizens. We also know that Black students face a higher suspension and expulsion rate. We know that Black women in Canada, while only, you know, they face an unemployment rate of 11%, which is more than double the national average, if you can take a moment to think about that. They also earn 63 cents to the white male and 85 cents to the white woman. And so, and I mean, we can spend a lot of time on even just speaking on the Canadian child welfare system and how Black parents are 40% more likely to be reported and investigated by Child Protective Services than white parents. And there was a recent study that was done in Toronto that 80% of the population is Black. In 2013, which is the last stat that I could find, Black children represented 42% of children in Toronto's Children Aid Society. And so we know that recent consultations and surveys that have been done show that people of African descent are disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. We know that structural and systemic racism have profoundly impacted on the fairness and equitable access to healthcare, to housing, to fair treatment, to our justice system, to education. We are impacted in every single sector. And Black people in Canada continue to suffer the social, political, and economic impacts of colonization, slavery, over-policing. And this pandemic, like I said, has only worsened those challenges faced by our community. And so I think it's time for us to get past this idea of figuring out what the problem is. We know what the problem is. And now we have to get to a place where we have to save lives. It's a life or death situation now, more than ever, and we can't wait anymore. And so I know we hear this all the time, but the time really is now.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that, Dabo. I guess as we move to the other panelists, and now I'm going to ask that Linton respond, and then Anne-Marie to the same question. It is interesting, as you mentioned, and I wonder if we could at some point understand why it does take Black people's lives, that we have to always seem to be putting our lives on the line and bearing our sufferings in order to get any attention. And I'd like to move to Linton, if you could respond to the question. Thanks.
Thank you, June, and thank you for having me here and being a part of this panel. My first impression in terms of the COVID pandemic, the first demonstrable effect in our community is that fully 25% of the personal service workers or the préposés aux bénéficiaires who are working within the health field are Black persons. And as such, we are disproportionately affected by the contraction of the disease, as well as in terms of being utilized as the people who are most in contact with the COVID disease. These are really because of some systemic issues that have prevented the Black community from being much further up in, shall we say, in terms of the healthcare system. The préposés or the personal service workers are at the front lines. They're the lowest paid, all right, the lowest remunerated people within the system. And that is in particular because we don't seem to have recognition, first of all, of credentials for people who come from other countries in terms of their particular service within the medical profession. Secondly, it is the only way that people can get entry, in particular because their credentials aren't recognized, so they are forced to be able to, even though they may have training at another level, they will have to go into the front line or the entry level of within the health sector. And I think thirdly, what we see is because there isn't any attention to the idea that there is any value that is placed on the experience or the understanding of our communities in disbursement of healthcare, and particularly to our communities and to other ethnic communities. It's one of the things about systemic racism is not a recognition of the other, or that the other has any value. And so therefore, system planning takes place only in terms of the majority and not in terms of the minority community. So as such, the particular issues and concerns of the Black community and other minority communities are not taken into account, such as access to information, access to the healthcare in the first place, an understanding of the issues which impact those communities as health issues. There are no health indicators, for those particular populations about how they are affected or how things are, how they produce themselves or present themselves in terms of minority communities. So as we talk about disaggregated statistics, we don't have an understanding of exactly how many of the general diseases affect our community, whether it's diabetes or cancer or emphysema. There aren't any indicators. So systemic racism prevents those issues from being a part of the lexicon that is within the medical profession. And therefore, as the pandemic unfolded, it wasn't taken into account the conversation of the information distribution and how our community would be affected.
Thank you so very much for highlighting some of the critical issues around credentialing. Some people's experience as they come to Canada are valued more than others, so that that experience becomes racialized as well, and some are valued, and the issue of inclusion in systemic planning. Let's now go to Anne-Marie. Thank you for responding to that question as well.
Hi, good morning, everybody. June, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And I wanted to just note that actually the work that I did with my colleagues in Montreal on policing is actually a project that was done on the side and in response to concerns expressed to me and some other people about police brutality. But my main work is actually on anti-poverty policy or social policy and questions of race in Canada. I just also wanted to mention that unfortunately I was pulled into this panel at the last minute. I only had 1 week to prepare. I'm glad to be here, but I'm in the middle of a move from Boston to Montreal. So I'm gonna have to keep my remarks short because my schedule has been overwhelming and I really haven't had enough time to give this, I think, the attention it deserves. But with regard to the first question, I think I would make 3 points. The first would be that if I think of Quebec, the pandemic has really showed how systemic racism is an intersectional process. I think everybody knows what I mean by intersectional. But, you know, it sort of manifests all the vulnerabilities, right? So, you know, around immigration, potentially around language, around gender, status, you know, citizenship status. So it throws into relief just how intersectional inequalities are in our society, as we saw with, you know, the ways in which frontline workers, many of them immigrant women, have had to fill the gaps, you know, in our elderly care system that were unfortunately exacerbated by the pandemic. So the first point would be that, you know, the inequality and race are intersectional. And in relation to that, I think that, you know, with regard to the Black population, I think it's, you know, we ought to perhaps all think about, you know, we know that race puts people at higher risk of morbidity and mortality. And we may, I think what we're seeing in Canada is also that being Black or, you know, having, facing racial inequality puts you at risk of what American scholars say, premature death. So you're more likely to die, you know, have a shorter life expectancy. And though we don't have, unfortunately, the data in Quebec to show that, I think we can assume it from the trends. So that would be something, I think, a conversation that should happen in Canada. The second point I would make is that, you know, I find that academia and policy in Quebec is where I can speak most knowledgeably. People of color, Black people, you know, have largely, these sort of vulnerable populations in the pandemic have largely been invisible. And so that means that we have a lot of catching up to do in our understanding of what are the very challenges of these populations, how we can alleviate the impacts of systemic racism and other forms of discrimination on the population. So the fact that they've largely been invisible also means that I think our current context is ill-equipped to deal appropriately with the challenges we face. You know, institutions, because they have neglected questions of race, you know, may as a accidentally compound the problems of these populations because they lack the tools and the knowledge to address them. So we have some catching up to do, I guess would be the main point in both our knowledge and in the ways in which our institutions and our policies are adapted to those realities.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie.
Mm-hmm.
You bring up this word invisibility.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so important, I think, in the context of understanding, in addition to the other issues of intersectionality and the cross-sectoral ways in which systemic racism shows up, this notion of invisibility, which leads me to my second question. in the UN report, the UN recommended that governments of Canada should review all forms of racial discrimination. And specifically, they point to the implication of the use of the term visible minority. They've challenged Canada on this because they think it's important to interrogate this idea so as to address more precisely the socioeconomic gaps and other disparities between and within different ethnic groups. So I'm asking you now, and I'm going to start with you, Linton. How has Canada's much heralded multiculturalism policy acted to obscure, recreate, and perhaps also embed systematic racism and as well white supremacy? How has this much heralded policy acted to do the very opposite to what it was intended to do in many cases? And if you would start, Linton.
Thank you, June. I think principally what it has done, it has labeled our communities and has allowed, I imagine, a certain connotations to be attached to those labels as being, as being visible by minorities or cultural ethnic communities, whichever you want to call it. There's a value or a label that's been attached to them that associates them with particular problems. The idea of multiculturalism also leaves the work sort of to somebody else, in the sense that we seem to think that because we are labeled as a multicultural society, that everything is hunky-dory, that people easily flow in and out of our societies without much difficulty because we make space for them. And we don't. Canadian society hasn't done so. Some of the issues that, for instance, Peter referred to in his opening, in particular the Fred Christie story, where the Supreme Court of Canada underlined the fact that you can discriminate. This is back in 1939, though, but you can discriminate, against any particular group if the person so decides. So we've left it open to somebody else to be able to determine what it is and what kind of role that we can play in our society. And I think that has had a really damaging effect because it hasn't actively involved people in inclusion and in involving minority communities within the everyday fabric of society. We are looked at through the multicultural lens as either we must have these people in, or that these people are here by the grace of our multicultural policy, and that they bring something different or foreign to us that we must absorb or that we must observe. And it creates sometimes a certain amount of resentment, which in further creates barriers between us and the general population. So I think multiculturalism, although seemingly good in its intent in the beginning, has labeled minority communities as problematic, as an issue that has to be dealt with, but mainly dealt with by government or government policies, and does not actively engage the community in being a part of that integrated process that the multiculturalism ideal seems to suggest.
Thank you so much for that. And it would be a surprise to many Canadians, I think, to hear that this multicultural policies, in fact, creates its own barriers, as you underlined so well, creating a distinction between us and them, and then the problematic way with which communities are dealt with, as if they are some problem to be dealt with, right, as opposed to exist. So I'd like to now turn, if I may, to Anne-Marie, if you could give us your comments on that, please. Thank you.
Sure. All right, so about multiculturalism, I do not withhold my critiques. I mean, I think we know it's had some positive effects. If I think of the work of Irene Bloomrad, you know, who compares it to the US and who finds that our multiculturalism policy has promoted, you know, the political participation and citizen acquisition of immigrants in Canada. But when it comes to systemic racism, it falls absolutely short. And I would make maybe, again, I'll summarize my ideas in a few points. First, I would say that I believe multiculturalism is not an idea, but an ideology. And on the one hand, the concept itself, I think, is problematic or questionable. And also there's an important gap between the principle and the practice and the policy. So when we talk about multiculturalism, you know, as an idea, may not be what we see in actual fact. So the first problem I see with multiculturalism, and this is not any new idea, this has been written by other scholars, Canadian scholars, you know, that what it does is it centers whiteness without naming it, because it remains silent on settler colonialism, you know, and let's say anti-Blackness. And also it presumes that we can have cultural equality without taking into account power inequalities, power differentials. So as a concept itself, it is deficient and, you know, deserving of thoroughgoing critique. And then the other issue is that it is not, I think that it falls well short of of meeting the needs if we're talking about racial equality in Canada. So we know that it focuses mostly on cultural equality and not questions of income or access to jobs. So it doesn't deal with the material outcomes that result, you know, from racism. And I had one more point to say. My apologies. Yeah, so it leaves a yawning gap between sort of the promises of equality and the actual fact, because it ignores or downplays power differentials, and it doesn't center the importance of white supremacy or whiteness on the very foundation of Canadian society.
Thank you for raising some really important points on the gap between principles and policy, for example. I think what you captured with not an idea, but an ideology, and the centering of whiteness is so important to this discussion. I'd like to now turn Dabo, if you would, and give us your thoughts on this question.
Okay, you know, I love what Linton said, and I absolutely love what Anne-Marie said, because we are talking about this group of people that feel like they need to be dealt with. And definitely, I think that the principle and definitely the practice and the policy are not functional right now. But if I'm always someone who sort of goes back to the root and the history, and I know Peter talked about that before in terms of the root cause. And you know, when the federal multiculturalism policy was first announced in 1971, it was described as this way to enlighten. It was an enlightenment policy to allow individuals to pursue this cultural life of their free choice. And so there were hearings in the House of Commons, special committee on participation of visible minority, and I put it in quotation for a reason, in 1983. And some of the witnesses, many of the witnesses representing representing national organizations of racial minorities, spoke about the prevalence of racial discrimination in Canadian society and the need for government to make institutional and legislative change in order to combat racism. This is something that we're talking about very early on. And so the growth of visible minority population has intensified that critique of this multiculturalism policy as being too much oriented towards the cultural preservation and sort of that white supremacy and white privilege. And we weren't using those terms then, but then they were talking about cultural preservation and not enough towards promoting social equality. And so in 1987, again, in the House of Commons Special Committee on Multiculturalism, stated that it was not always accurate to assume that cultural orientation of the multiculturalism policy was enunciated as something that was established, and that it was really just mostly European people or European origin. And so, and as the visible minority population increased, and along with it, a greater concern was voiced around the question of racism and discrimination. And there was this apparent contention between this cultural orientation and equality orientation. And they were using different terminologies, different languages, but really that's what they were talking about. They were talking about white privilege, they were talking about white supremacy and white power. And so, and then this critique on the multiculturalism policy started to really sharpen. And so this, there has been honestly an increased racial diversity in the Canadian society since the 1980s. And it's created this new demographic, and this political reality now demanded that policy to change, but it hasn't. And it is clear that the greater emphasis that was put on this multiculturalism policy as a vehicle to promote racial equality and racial harmony in Canadian society was false, was a falsehood. It wasn't something that was actually happening in the day-to-day lives of those that were being impacted. And so it would be incorrect to assume that the demographic basis of racial diversity alone was sufficient to promote emphasis on multiculturalism. And instead of looking at it from how do we now work towards a greater social equality? So demographic changes, the politics of multiculturalism were not the only factors that contributed to the racial differences in Canada. And in reality, the racial distinctions are also reproducing that unequal life chances, and starts to make this the lives of people of color and Black communities specifically normal. That there's, and to be honest, there has been substantial evidence up until today that Canadian societies contribute to the unequal social value of people of color and people of different origin. And many studies have shown that Canadians that are non-white minorities are socially less desirable and less favorable than people of European origin. And despite the absence of evidence that non-white immigrants are weakening the unity and the cohesion of Canada, because that's what we hear on the other side, it is often suggested that too much of the racial and cultural diversity will lead to the fragmentation of our Canadian society. So I think that we really need to look at the root, look at where the multiculturalism policy came from, who it's supposed to serve, and who it doesn't serve. And this is something that's been talked about over decades now. And we're here now on June 23rd, talking about the same thing. And so I think it's important to look at what systems do, and the fact that this policy has in fact just reinforced anti-Black racism and unequal chances for our community, and it speaks to white supremacy.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dabo, for revealing and really, I hope, illuminating the issues of power, who is served and who it does not serve, this policy of multiculturalism. I once had heard one of our governor generals refer in illustrating this policy, said that it was so wonderful to eat the foods of our immigrants, relating to this issue of cultural preservation being its goal, and ignoring the many points that have been raised about inequality in other spaces. Who does it serve? So as we try to figure out who it serves and who it doesn't serve, I come to my final question, and I'd ask that Anne-Marie, we will start with you. Everyone on this call has said in public spheres, elsewhere, those of you are listening have also called for race-based disaggregated data, as of course, we become invisible and it's not transparent, and we can't do anything about it. So if we have no data to support it, the UN has pointed out as well that there's race-based data absolutely needed to protect the human rights of African Canadians. But the question I put to you is, I think we all agree that this is a systemic problem. It goes well beyond putting an appropriate race-based question on a questionnaire, which is where I know so much has centered. So I'm asking you, what are your recommendations for addressing systemic racism and white supremacy in the context of research and race-based data collection, as we will move to some actual data later. But what are your recommendations on the methodologies that we need to employ, and what should we know about racism in academia, institution, funding agencies, and in our research protocol? I'll start with you, Anne-Marie.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, June. I just remembered a point I wanted to make about multicultural. Could I just throw it in quick?
For sure.
Okay, yeah, so I wanted to say that, you know, I've heard scholars give presentations on multiculturalism, Canadian multiculturalism, and I was surprised how they took it for granted. And so what I worry about multiculturalism as an ideology is it it affirms this sort of Canadian myth of tolerance, right, vis-a-vis the US. And it seems to lead some people, maybe the larger Canadian public, and then even some, sort of policymakers or whatever, to think that our work is done, right? Yes, we're tolerant, everything's good, so now let's move on to some other issues. And so I think that's I think we need to constantly push back against the power of multiculturalism to hide questions of racism and racial inequality in Canada. Okay, so on to research. Or data disaggregation. I would like to point people out to an absolutely excellent paper that I read several years ago, and I'm always referring back to it. And it's called, and I can share it with Jack Jedwab, and it's called Researching Black Educational Experiences and Outcomes, Theoretical and Methodological Considerations by Carla O'Connor, Amanda Lewis, and Jennifer Mueller. And what is so important about this piece is that it really sort of breaks down all of the problems with demographic research on race, sociological, quantitative research on race, the kinds of taken for granted assumptions that go into, the setting up of quantitative models and the interpretation. And, they really underline that, unfortunately, sociology has been complicit, in the, how should I say, in refueling racial stereotypes about Black people, through ignoring, mainly by treating race as if it were a real thing, as if it were, a fact of life rather than a political process. So one has to be very, very cautious that quantitative methods are not race neutral, that we have to think very, very carefully of how we're using our concepts and our variables. And the main point I would make is that we need to, even in quantitative data, we need to think of race not as a bodily condition, but as a political process. So how do you do that? Well, one way that Carla O'Connor et al. Suggests is that whenever you analyze racial inequality, you always intersect it or correlate it with all the sort of various dimensions that might come into play in reproducing racial inequality. Start from the assumption that, Black people are not, should I say, a wholly disadvantaged group. They do have agency. So it's important to take into account, okay, how does race intersect with income, with occupation, with gender, with sexuality, and other dimensions, so we can get a better grasp of, what are the processes that are happening that underlie and reproduce racial inequality, rather than putting the emphasis on Black people as a group. Because I've seen, I was actually contacted by Statistics Canada this winter to review some reports on Black Canadians. And what I found inadequate in some of the analysis was the fact that they were treating Black as if it was a real thing, rather than a described characteristic and a systemic process. So by, for example, saying Black unemployment is, I don't know, 5% higher than white unemployment, without going into detail about, okay, what is that a function of? Is that a function of immigration? Is that a function of education? Is that a function of occupation, and so on? So don't treat race as if it is a objective reality, but rather as a ascribed characteristic and political process. And in that process, you bring in the intersectional analyses, right? By correlating race with other dimensions of inequality. And I would just add one last thing, that we can't assume that we can examine, the problem with race is that it gets confused or mixed up with questions of identity. Yes, Black people do identify as Black, but I don't think that we can interpret identity from statistical data. That's my contention. It may be open to debate, but I think we shouldn't confuse identity with political process in our statistical analyses. That's it.
Thank you. And that was done very succinctly. And I see that time is running, so I just move to the next person. Dabo, would you take this next?
Yes. So around solutions, I mean, I'm going to be very, very short on this one, because I think that the more concrete we are in terms of our potential solutions, the easier it is to get it done. I don't want it to be broad, and I definitely don't want it to be about consultation. And I'm considering the current climate that we're in under COVID-19, and obviously the rise in anti-Black racism. And one of the first things is absolutely the collection of race-based data. There is a lack of race-based data in research that could inform the prevention, intervention, and strategies to protect human rights of people of African descent. And unfortunately, anti-Black racism is present, like I said, in all sectors. And again, unfortunately, there's minimal quantifiable Canadian data detailing that negative consequence of racism. And we know, we feel it, and we live it every day, that we know that racism is killing us. And so I think that the collection, the reporting of race-based data during this pandemic is a critical component of understanding how to address anti-Black racism in Canada, because we cannot address what is not being measured. And again, it's past time for Canadians across Canada to really have an honest look at the state of race in our nation, and to relinquish this notion of colorblindness. So that's the first thing I'll say. The second thing is this global conversation around defunding of police. I think that there is, I love to explain what that means, at least to me. That's a reallocation of police funding. And it's definitely the need for those resources to go to social services and well-being and safety. I think that municipalities can really begin by changing policies. So police officers never respond to incidents or emergencies that include substance abuse, that include homelessness, that include mental health, crises. We just heard yesterday that an elderly man in Ontario was shot and killed in his apartment while he was having a mental health crisis, and they jumped through his balcony to get to him. And so, despite the pleas of the family saying that he's schizophrenic and he needs a family member, somebody that he recognizes. And so I think that there is something to be done about ensuring that our first responders and those that are supposed to respond to crises in the midst, in the midst of danger, that they don't have armed forces, that they don't have law enforcement that draws their guns, batons, and their weapons on people that don't need weapons, that need love, care, and safety. And so I think there needs to be a rapid response team of social workers. I think that there's a need for conflict interrupters and sort of this idea of restorative justice teams that could really mediate in these situations so that they do not threaten the lives of people. And so I think the reallocation of community, reallocation of police funding need to go to community-based solutions. And we've said this many, many times. It's our community that knows what we need, and nothing about us should ever be done without us. And so how do we make sure that our municipalities, our provinces, and our government understand that we need changes that are going to be about wellness and safety? They're going to be about saving the lives of people instead of it being about enforcement, and instead of being about the foundation of what policing was. And I see June going like this on me, so I have another recommendation, but I'll put it in the chat.
Just go for it quickly if it can be done quickly. Since you remember.
So I think, yes, I do. There was a report that was done on the independent oversight review of police institutions in Ontario. And there was a Bill 175. Please, if you don't know it, Google it. I'll put the link up. But it was a review that was done by a Black judge here in Ontario. And it was an incredible oversight of all of our police institutions and provided accountability to the way that they function. And that was repealed 2 days prior to it being implemented. And the reason that was given to the community was that the Ford government needed to do a review of the review. And so I think we're past the reviews, we're past about poking us and trying to figure out what's going on with our community. It's clear. So Google the Bill 175 and speak to your elected officials about implementing that in Ontario and in every province in Canada.
Thank you so very much. You used the reference to Gore, and I can't remember. It reminds me very much of how often the data is missing, and so our jobs become one of bearing our souls and our pain as the evidence involved. It exhausts us. It reveals us in ways we don't particularly want to many times, but in the absence of data, we often find ourselves on the front line. So I am often asked to prove racism exists, and I have to resort to my own experiences that I'd rather keep, I need therapy for them, actually, and you're not, and bringing it up 100 times about how devastating these things have been to us can no longer be the evidence that Canada seeks over and over again. So I now ask Linton if you would take this up. Thank you so much, Deb.
Yes, well, the idea about statistics and information and research, first of all, I think what we need to do is proceed towards an understanding that there should be nothing about us without us, as was referred to a little bit earlier. In the sense that when doing research, we need to be able to have people from our communities as integral parts of those research projects. First of all, in many cases, institutional approaches, they don't know our community. They don't know where to engage our community. They have no understanding of the historical development of the population of the Black community here in Canada, about understanding those people who are Indigenous to Blacks to Canada, about the arrivals of the Caribbean community and their path through Canadian society, as well as the more new African communities that have been arriving and that are populating areas like the West, which is one of the fastest growing Black community areas in the country. And so we need to be able to make sure that we know who to engage and how to engage those people in a discussion about in research on those issues. Secondly, the original or researchers usually have just a particular idea of what it is that they want to research, and with assuming that the same things affect everybody. And our community and many other ethnic communities or even immigrant communities are affected very differently by societal structures. And so therefore can't have possibly the same, we can't assume they have the same outcomes or the same effects or the same barriers. There needs to be a better understanding that we are disproportionately or affected in many ways, like we're talking about incarceration or in the presence within the youth and family services area, or we talk about our overrepresentation in terms of the higher unemployment rates, and as well, less opportunities for jobs and so on. So when we look at doing research, it's not just about statistics in the sense of understanding about the general population. It is about what really affects our community, and we can't possibly pay justice to those issues if we are not involved in the evaluation process of the statistics, and if the community isn't properly engaged through our own structures, our community organizations, our community institutions, and involved in a partnership in gathering that information. There's a large mistrust in our community about giving over statistical information about our community, because it's been mistreated in many other cases, in previous cases, and used against our community as well, and certainly used as a way of portraying our community as problematic. So from that standpoint, doing research within our community has to involve people who can be perceived as being trusted, all right, and also be perceived as having the best interest of our community in the revelation of the information that the researchers require.
Thank you so much, Linton. And we will move shortly into the question and answer. But I guess we could underscore what was just said by the panelists here, that what we're talking to is a complete stranglehold, to be quite honest. I think we've discussed this before, by the research industrial complex. So if we look at funding agencies, despite having, statements of equality, we continue to see only certain researchers funded. We look at academies. In the academy, these are largely white spaces all across universities, creating a stranglehold. We look at research institutions, and we ask that that's another area that needs to be addressed. And so as we go across the spectrum of not just the actual research, as nothing without us for us, we're talking about us rising to the very pinnacle of these institutions to ensure that they are responsive, because this is a systemic challenge. I see that Anne-Marie wants to make a comment on that, and I don't know, Dabo's put on her video, so are you trying to respond to this as well? No,
Please,
it's Anne-Marie. Okay.
Well, I just remembered you said you would give me a moment to mention our open letter.
Yes.
It's another reason why my schedule has been through the roof this week. So basically I'm working with a group in Montreal. We've written an open letter to SSHRC about a grant that was awarded to l'Observatoire sur les profilages at the University of Montreal for research on racial profiling. And in the open letter, we describe why we think the Observatoire does not have the capacity, the background, or the perspective to lead this kind of research. We've issued a press release this morning as well. So you can find all the information on the Facebook page for Montréal sans profilage. That's MTL sans SANS profilage, PROFILAGE. So we're still collecting signatures, and please pass on the word if you can.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. That was a bit of a signal to you, so thank you for picking it up. As we move into the question and answer session, I'd encourage you to drop that in the chat if you could, Anne-Marie.
Yes,
the link,
okay.
That people can use so that it can be available right away.
All right.
I want to make sure if somebody would just let me know how many minutes are left. I'm going to just keep going, but in the chat, to make sure that I know how much time we have for question and answers. I will start with this question, and there are a lot of beautiful questions, and I just choosing this one to start with. But I encourage everybody to look at all the questions, and if the panelist has the chance, if you have the chance to answer, that would be fantastic in the chat. But I'll pick up on one here, and also a young person from York University who has asked to make a couple of points if we can. I'm not sure how that would work, but let me just start with this question to the panel. How do you balance the support of race-based data and the fear among respondents when providing that information? The fear of being further scrutinized, further harmed, and fear for safety. Or fear of being deported. How do we reassure our communities, as Linton pointed out, the historically difficult relationship our communities have had with data. What is your statement? What needs to happen to create trust around this data? Who would like to answer this? Maybe the panelists all could put on their videos at this point so we could see who is prepared to respond to this.
Well, I would.
Go ahead, Linton.
Yeah, the first thing was when I talked about nothing about us without us, it needs to mean that there needs to be sanctioned research by our communities, through our community organizations, through institutions that can be trusted, or at least have been perceived as having the best interests of our community. A hospital or a service center that has never put its foot into our community who now wants to do research on health outcomes for pregnant mothers within our community won't be trusted to be able to, to respond in the way in which that information can be used correctly. But if we've been used to working with a local community organization, and they are working with this institution to provide the health information, that can diminish the mistrust somewhat. Secondly, many times we see the research never amounts to anything in terms of an implementation or in service. It doesn't change the service in any way. The service then says, well, we can't adapt to everybody. We want to take a broad spectrum, all right? And therefore you all have to fit into that spectrum rather than us being able to pay individual attention or attention to your individual needs, all right? Or your needs as a particular community. So we never see it reflected that way. So the really only way to really create that balance is, again, by having people who are trusted from the community, who are able to conduct the research, and B, making sure that that research then gets reflected in the institutional practices, all right, around the delivery of service, all right, that is supposed to result.
Thank you so much for that answer. And I think I'm going to move on. Thank you so much. That illustrated some important points, and I think we may be in a position to move on this. There is a person, I don't know, I shouldn't infer age here. There's a Sandrine Porter who said, I'm a recent graduate from the sociology program at York University. May I share a few points? Sandrine, if you're available and you want to reveal yourself quickly, I don't know if that's possible. If it is, I give the mic to you right now.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can. And you're free to show your video as well. But you don't have to, so go ahead.
Thank you so much. I must start by saying thank you all for such an empowering presentation. One of the many questions that is quite staggering is, where do we go from here, right? With everything going on, and we see how the media take that. And I think we've reached a place now where with all these changes and fighting for changes, is now that we have reached a certain point, where do we go from here? How do we, I guess, come into perspective with these changes? There's no doubt that changes of systemic racism needs to be adjusted at the grassroots and looking at the structural factors that keep reproducing these pandemics, right? But who are those that are involved in the conversation? And I like that Dahabu, that's how we pronounce the name. Yes, you mentioned about, changes in like who's in the conversation, and you're right, we can't have changes of talking about changes about visible minority and in the community and how it impacts us without involving us from the community in these conversations as well, right? As there is a lot of strategy that focus on how we can start changes within the community. heavily impacted by this injustice. But it's like, how is the narrative taken from the perspective, who's telling this story? And there's a lot of one-sided stories as how things are happening, one-sided stories how things are received from the media as well. Another thing is that many of the conversation about systemic racism, I think, is from the lens of presentism. That concept, presentism, is how we see things now. And when we look at things in the way it is now, we start to dismiss this historical framework of how things have come to be. And I like that that was also raised in the conversation, is we need to go back and look at the historical framework of how we have come here, where we're at now, and where we're gonna go from here, right? So thank you so much for allowing me to share.
Thank you so very much. Would anybody, thank you so much for taking the courage to share those comments, and from your perspective as a student who is a young student who is revealing to us your perspective. That's a very valuable perspective to have shared here, and I appreciate that. Would anybody want to comment on anything that was said by Sandrine? If not, let's go on to Daba. Go ahead. I just noticed you're trying to get my attention. Go ahead.
No, it's okay. It's okay. No, what I was gonna say was I was gonna thank Sandrine for her comments, but also just reiterate that absolutely, I think the narrative is being told by people and institutions that do not know our realities, and so I think it just perpetuates the idea that other people can speak for us. Other people know what's good for us. Other people can put us where they need us to be. And there's other people, the other people need to stop. I think it's time that it's realized in every level of government, in every institution. And you know, the concept behind dismantling white supremacy and white privilege and all of those things is about giving up power and giving it to those that have not had it, those that need it, and those that have been fighting for it and dying for it. And so I think that when we are telling our stories, it does have to be us. It has to be us in boardrooms, in government, in media, everywhere. It has to be Black communities speaking for themselves. And so there has to be this shift that happens, and dismantling that, to me, is giving up power. So when I speak to institutions and organizations, the first question I ask is, you know, what are you going to do in terms of your boards? What are you going to do in terms of your committees? What are you going to do in terms of your staffing and your hiring processes? How are you going to ensure that the people that have the power are Black communities and people of color and Indigenous communities? How are you going to do that? Because that is dismantling power. That's making sure that now we have individuals within these institutions and organizations that are constructing a system that now responds to the needs of their community. It wasn't built for us, and it will not serve us if we don't deconstruct it and build it in a way that's inclusive.
Thank you so much. I see there have been some questions here that, and I'm getting a sense that there needs to be perhaps a longer conversation that elucidates this issue of the challenge of multiculturalism in the context of Canadian as ideology and the impact of multiculturalism. People pointing out quite rightly the data that indicates that if you look, for example, this is around racialized communities, and picking up on your point, Dabo, that you look at the very top of organizations. I know my research shows that despite being in a city, an area with 51% visible minorities, we look at nonprofit boards and it's 13, and with corporate boards, 8%. What I'm saying is, you need to reverse that. 92% of the people are on corporate boards are white, and also almost 87%, going on to 90% again, are white on nonprofit boards. These are boards that I took out the boards that are definitely aimed at ethnic communities, but looking at, and racial communities, but looking at the rest of them, you end up with this number. And what's amazing is this number is consistent across the entire country. So if you go to Toronto, you go across to Montreal. Montreal is lower always on these numbers. I shouldn't say, it even gets lower in Montreal, which is amazing to the rest of us. And what we now realize is that is tokenism. Not that the people on the boards are tokens, but it's an attempted tokenism. Because you see, within this multicultural idea, any one of us are substitutable for the others. So if we have one of something or two of something other than white, people actually perceive their boards as actually more diverse than it is. They actually think it's okay because we have a couple people over here that don't look like us, who have entered our REM. They don't even begin to talk about inclusion. And so it's been a challenging thing to say to Canadians, you have held power. You are holding on with relentless tenacity in power while talking about multiculturalism. So I wondered if we could double back on this issue to help people understand how deeply it has failed communities, this notion of multiculturalism.
Sure.
Okay, Linton, go ahead.
You know, those of us who've been used to this multicultural dance have always referred to multiculturalism as the 4 Ds: dance, diet, dress, and dialect. And that's always what we used to see all the time when there seemed to be celebrating multiculturalism, that it was just a surface investigation of who we are. So your comment about a former governor general talking about they get a chance to eat our food, you know, they get to see us in traditional dress, they love to hear the accents or language, and then they love to see a cultural expression of who we are through our dance. Those were the elements that were always present in any kind of multicultural celebration, and there still seems to be when the government tries to demonstrate that it's trying to embrace its different communities. We never see that we have a revelation within of an institutional approach to the issue. So presenting the particular police department and showing that the leadership in the police department reflects the multicultural presence of the communities that it serves. We never get a revelation through the media that the anchor persons or research persons or camera persons or you know, technical support reflect in any way the proportions of the community that it is broadcasting to. We never get to see within the education milieu a curriculum that reflects the historical presence of these communities or tackles issues which are important to them, particularly issues around inclusion and discrimination and the active practice of systemic racism, in the sense that that the whole institutional approach from the beginning has been a definition of whiteness versus anything else. And so we don't get to see those kinds of things presented in any significant way. And so that belies the call for these multiculturalism, multicultural practice, or what they think is the multicultural ethic in this society.
Thank you so much for that. I would like now to, Anne-Marie, did you put your hand?
Yeah, could I add something?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, we've been talking a lot about the multiculturalism policy, but I would even argue that the anti-racism policy as it currently stands is kind of, will only go so far. I mean, we submitted a grant to the program to do some work on racial profiling, and it's typical of, you know, sort of government programs where it's project-based, right? So you've got 1 year, maybe 2 or 3 to do some work around a particular topic, and systemic racism is not going to be solved through projects, right? And so I think we also, you know, it makes me think, as somebody who's worked inside government and who studied government, I think we shouldn't have, how should I say, we have to be very, very careful about what we think the government can do. I don't think the government is in the business of affecting systemic change, you know, in the ways that we might want to envision it, right? You know, where Indigenous people, for example, have their full place in Canadian society, and other groups, you know, where racism is eliminated. I don't think that we can expect that of the government, because it's not in the business of creating systemic change. So we have to hold it accountable for those kinds of results. And I think the anti-racism program is an example of that. It's not aiming for systemic change. It's project-based, it seems to me, on the whole.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. And
Yep.
we've often heard the critique as well that sorry, I've forgotten the whole lingo of this training, anti-Black racism training or this kind of approach actually reveals something rather than it solves something. And what it reveals is the inadequacy of the dominant population, that we're actually filling gaps. So we're training people often only because they are deficient in understanding racist issues. So then we put a lot of our funding towards funding certain kinds of training by the dominant group, which actually takes resources from economic inclusion and all the other ways in which we want to be included, and that many of us actually have the capacity. Yeah. So hire us, empower us, give us power, and you don't have to actually, and through those processes, the complex nature of systemic racism, you in fact bring in the true capacity, rather than simply thinking you can put a Band-Aid on a system that was completely designed for one dominant group.
Employment equity is a systemic policy, but it's weakly enforced, right?
Exactly. So I'm going to go to a young woman who I hope I haven't lost, Shamila. I think that's a female, anyway, a person who is called Shamila Adha. I thought it was a student, but actually it doesn't say that here, so I take that back. Shamila Adha, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing your name. If you could take the mic, you wanted to share. I'd ask you to constrain your comments to about a minute or so. Thank you so much, Shamila.
Hi, can you hear my voice?
Yes.
Okay, so one of the things I feel is that, like, for this issue to have inclusion is like people embracing the thoughts that like so much injustice has been done like towards the Black communities, because at the end of the day, I think corporate companies look for isomorphism, and isomorphism means like if all the companies are doing certain kind of policies, the other companies tend to follow, and it's mainly by the market leaders. So, and also if the pressure comes from consumers or like from the general public, I think some of the systemic racism can be eliminated, because at the end of the day, if we go on increasing the representation of Blacks, for example, for corporate companies, it may well be the fact that they are complying to the mandates of the whites or the leaders in those companies, and that's why they're getting selected. So ultimately, it's not doing anything to eliminate the systematic racism. And also another point that Linton I think pointed out about multiculturalism. I think multiculturalism is also kind of emphasizing on the differences. For example, how Black community is different from white community, how their food is different, how their accent is different. And perhaps it also gives the space for the people to judge actually how Black community is inferior or superior to white communities. So anything like I mean, like, I think organizing people and perhaps like increasing more awareness from the communities, from the public, from the consumers will perhaps do something to eliminate this systematic racism. But I will always kind of like to know your perspectives, all of your perspectives on the same. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for sharing your thoughts. I would like to get in a few more people, a few more questions or comments, then we'll go back to the panel. I see that Comey has had a hand up and I've missed it. Comey, please feel free to take the mic now and let us have your comments. If you could restrict it to 1 minute. Thank you so much.
Oui, allô?
Hello, Comey, go ahead.
Oui, bonjour. D'abord, je tiens vraiment à vous remercier pour votre présentation. C'était vraiment instructif. Mais j'ai une question à vous poser. C'est de savoir, si je prends par exemple la communauté chinoise. Est-ce que vous m'entendez toujours?
Oui, maintenant, il était coupé auparavant.
Oh, OK. D'abord, je tenais à vous remercier pour ce que vous avez dit. Mais je vais prendre un exemple, par exemple, de la communauté asiatique, chinoise qui est au Canada. Ils ont une forte représentation, ce qui permet au pouvoir politique en place de pouvoir les écouter, d'avoir une forme d'organisme à qui s'adresser quand ils veulent parler à cette communauté-là. Est-ce que ce ne serait pas important aussi pour nous, dans la minorité noire visible, d'avoir une forme d'organisme qui nous représente, qui peut être notre porte-parole une fois cette conversation franche là avec le gouvernement? Parce que le gouvernement peut-être veut bien discuter, mais on ne peut pas discuter dans l'individualisme avec chaque communauté de manière séparée. Ce serait bien d'avoir comme un secrétariat, quelque chose qui peut nous représenter et qui peut représenter une force sous forme de lobbying politique pour nous. Et puis, j'aimerais faire un autre point, par exemple, lorsque vous avez parlé du rôle du COVID, où la communauté minoritaire est plutôt celui qui soigne les gens dans la jeune enfance. C'est aussi la responsabilité de nos universités parce que je vais prendre le cas du Manitoba ici. Moi, je vis au Manitoba. La majorité des gens qui viennent ici pour étudier sont directement orientés vers la jeune enfance, vers des secteurs administratifs où il y a le besoin. On ne les oriente pas vers des choses qui peuvent leur apporter plus de choses. C'est ça aussi le problème parce qu'il faut avoir le débat dans ça. Ce sont nos institutions qui doivent jouer le rôle, surtout nos universités. J'aimerais savoir ce que vous en pensez et comment est-ce qu'on peut régler ces problèmes qui sont plus pratiques, je pense. Merci.
I'm going to turn it over to the panel, and if you would just respond to these last few questions. I do want to say thank you, first of all, to Comey. And then
maybe Dabo can help on that question.
Yeah, Dabo, would you like to jump in? But as you go to respond, I just wanted to add a comment that somebody has just put up that they'd like me to read. And it says that a system built on stolen lands by slaves will not be resolved by using the tools of the system. The master's tool will never dismantle the master's house. And I thought that was a succinct way of referencing some of the things that have been said.
Audre Lorde, is it?
Mm-hmm.
Definitely. We'll go to Dabo.
So thank you, Comey. You know, the point of actually the organization I represent is exactly that. It's to be able to, well, first of all, I think there's this idea that Black communities have, and I say communities in plural for a reason, because I think there's this idea that we all want the same thing, that we all see the same things the same way, that we've all been faced with the same challenges. And so there's this, we're such a diverse community within the Black community, and that the idea behind the Federation was actually to try to bring all of those perspectives, all of those histories, all of those challenges into a way where we can effect change for all Black communities. Anyone who is identified as a Black person, anyone who is identifies as a person of African descent. The idea behind the Federation is really to amplify the voices of our communities locally, knowing that, you know, we're all having these conversations in our regions, in our cities, and unfortunately, those voices are not being represented at the national level. They're not being represented within governments. And so the idea behind the Federation ultimately is to bring all of those voices on a national level, to make sure that we are sitting at those tables, that we are in those boardrooms, that we are speaking for our people, and that we are not, painting Black communities with one brush, and that we're doing it in such a way that continues to dig a hole for our community. It continues to impact us in such disproportionate ways that now we're all talking about, how government is not representative of us. And I don't personally know, and I'll take off my chair hat for a second and put on my Jahabo individual hat. I know representation matters. It absolutely does. But I also don't need to see a Black person to be treated fairly. I don't need to see a Black person in an organization, institution, in order for me to feel safe. I don't need that. The problem is systemic. And so when we talk about that, and I know we've had so many definitions of this, but my definition of systemic racism and ensuring that our voices are at the table is that it doesn't matter if you have 1 million employees into an institution. It doesn't matter. And any of those employees, every single person can be non-racist and or anti-racist, because there is a difference. And the system will continue to behave in such a way that is systematically impacting us in a disproportionate way. And that, to me, is what systemic racism is. It's not about making sure that we have Black people at the table only. It's to ensure that the way that the system has been constructed and structured, and its policies and its delivery and its understanding and its impact and its intention is for all of our communities. And so, hoping the Federation becomes that voice. It's been 5 years and we've been doing this work consistently, and we're going to keep doing it. And I'll share the link with you guys if you'd like to join and work with us. But that's the point, to ensure that we have systemic change, not just about getting rid of the bad apples. It's not about bad apples. It's about a system that was built. And I like the quote there, that we can't use those tools to dismantle it. We have to do it ourselves. And so hopefully, Komi, that answers your question a little bit. I know it's a big question.
And these are big issues. And as we thank you so much for that.
Can I throw in a comment?
It has to be quick because we're out of time.
Sure.
Thank you so
I
much.
just want to
Go
say,
right ahead.
Yeah, I'm supposed to be working on a book that compares Black political mobilization in Ontario and Quebec. And I would just kind of support what Dabo is saying, that to organize Black sort of people identifying as Black at the national is very complex, because you're covering a lot of diversity, cultural, regional, over issues. Our issues vary by province, by locality. So it's highly, highly complex. So the challenge is greater to organize at the national level for an organization like the Federation. And we are seeing at the local level in cities and in provinces that Black groups are organizing and having an impact on policy. In Ontario, concrete examples. Unfortunately, in Quebec, we are constrained by the history of nationalism, which silences questions of race, which silences racial identities. And so we are actually, how should I say, restricted by the state from organizing on the basis of race. And that's been a huge challenge here.
So we've come to an end, and I want to, first of all, thank you to the audience for being engaged and for sending your comments and questions. We note that, and we appreciate the time you have spent with us today. We hope that you have, in fact, been illuminated on these concepts. And these are important issues. And I hope you'll join me as the audience in thanking Dahabo Omer, Dr. Anne-Marie Livingston, and of course, our Linton Garner.
And June. You put this together.
Thank you. Can we applaud each other then for this, for this section? Thank you very much. That was wonderful. And I suspect this will be the start of our own friendship and our own continuing connection across the country. So I also thank the Federation, the ACE, and all of you for putting this together. I see that our time is done, and I think we all appreciate this conversation, and I think it's just beginning. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, June.
Thank
you, colleagues. Great to chat.
Thank you for everyone.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you so much for that. That was an incredibly rich and layered conversation. And thank you. You've already thanked all the panelists, but I will thank them again. Dabo Omer, Dr. Anne-Marie Livingston, and of course, Linton Garner. Thank you so much for exploring concepts we often also take for granted. Multiculturalism is the first one that comes to mind. Your discussion was incredibly illuminating as well in terms of how we have to redefine some of these concepts if we're really going to get to the root of systemic racism and move forward. As opposed to simply getting stuck in past conversations. So thank you again. The other important thing, of course, that was raised by the panel was the issue of data and how do you measure data and what data is useful and how do you make sure you're measuring it in a way that doesn't reinforce the racism that could be present or that it uncovers. So to discuss data now, we're going to be joined by another panel of great experts. I'm sure we will have a wonderful conversation with them too. I'd like to introduce the chair, Dr. Alicia Boatswain-Kite. Dr. Boatswain-Kite is an assistant professor at the School of Social Work at McGill University. She has over 10 years of clinical experience as a social worker with marginalized individuals, families, and groups. Most of this has been in the area of child protection. And her research interests center around the systematic oppression of racialized individuals and how this contributes to their unequal representation within different levels of society. She's involved with several community organizations, hoping and helping to improve the health and well-being of Black children and families in Montreal. Son enseignement d'Alicia compte à la fois de la pratique historique et contemporaine de travail social et la manière dont elle se rapporte avec les familles, les individus marginalisés. Sa pédagogie s'appuie sur l'importance de processus sociaux et relationnels dans le cadre de la justice sociale, tout en cherchant à développer la réflexivité critique des étudiants dans le cadre de leur pratique professionnelle du travail social. So again, moving forward in terms of how we measure data, what we measure, and how we use that in our relations with individuals. Dr. Boatswain-Kite, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction and for the invitation to chair this panel. I'm already blown away by just the level of discussion that we've had so far, and I've taken some really interesting notes, things that really stuck with me in terms of giving up power, the government not being in the business of systemic change, our need to really dismantle and rebuild. And so I'm really honored to be here. I think that the past few weeks have been very difficult, but also in some ways illuminating and inspiring, because I have been able to participate and connect with researchers, Black researchers across Canada, and to share space with community, with my community. And in those spaces, there's been a significant amount of healing that's been taking place, and understanding and planning. And so these spaces are really important. I think also in terms of just perceptions, realizing I've been confronted about just how different I think the language and our understanding and our definitions of things like systemic racism, racial discrimination, what it means to be anti-racist versus not racist or racist, are really interesting discussions. I think, I echo some of what's already been shared about doing this work in Quebec, and also with regards to Canada, just the reluctance of naming race and a silencing that sometimes occurs when we want to be able to get that data to illustrate at one point Black and brown bodies are facing social inequities. And at the same time, our lack of data prevents us from, being able to make changes at the policy level. And so it becomes this really vicious circle in terms of, our inability to show how we are victims of systemic racism because of the absence of race-based data in child welfare and justice, health, and education sectors. And so it's really important that we reclaim this data. And so I'm really happy to be joined by the other panelists. So first, our first speakers, I'm going to introduce them as we continue our discussion with regards to perceptions. I'm going to introduce Jack Jedwab, who is the president of the Association for Canadian Studies at the Canadian Institute for Identities and Migration, holding a PhD in Canadian history from Concordia University. He taught at Université du Québec à Montréal and McGill University. He has taught courses on the history of immigration in Quebec, on ethnic minorities in Quebec, on official language minorities in Canada, and on sport in Canada. He has also authored essays for books, journals, and newspapers across the country, in addition to being the author of various publications and government reports on issues of immigration, multiculturalism, human rights, and official languages. Joined is Ashley Manuel, who is an assistant director of the Association for Canadian Studies, holds an MA in Education and Society from McGill University, and an honors Bachelor's in Social Sciences in Conflict Studies and Human Rights, with a minor in Sociology from the University of Ottawa. Her work in government, nonprofit, and academic sectors has involved research in the fields of immigration, multiculturalism. Oops, I just lost my screen with our sharing the full screen. Yes, multicultural security, education, human rights, and public policy. Followed by the presentation, we'll have 3 panelists. Our first panelist is Robert Henry, who is the Assistant Professor, Faculty of Indigenous Studies, University of Saskatchewan. Is Métis from Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, whose research areas include Indigenous street gangs and gang theories, Indigenous masculinities, Indigenous and critical research methodologies, youth mental health, and visual research methods. Working closely with community partners, Robert works to create knowledge mobilization outcomes that reflect community needs and wants. He's published a photo voice narrative collection with Indigenous male gang members titled Brighter Days Ahead, and has recently submitted another collection in partnership with Indigenous females and their involvement in street gangs. Robert was the lead editor of Global Indigenous Health, Reconciling the Past, Engaging the Present, Animating the Future, and is co-editor on Settler City Limits, Indigenous Resurgence and Colonial Violence in Urban Prairie West, and 2 forthcoming collections on Indigenous health and art and Indigenous sociology. Robert has also published in the areas of Indigenous masculinity, Indigenous health, youth subcultures, and criminal justice. His current research focuses on the concept of survivance and its applicability within Indigenous research more broadly. We also have Alicia Clifford, who is a PhD student, Department of Health, Aging, and Society at McMaster University, Ontario Graduate Scholarship, 2019-2020. Research interests include Indigenous health and well-being, incarceration, gender, decolonization, community-based research, knowledge mobilization, qualitative methods, and institutional culture. And finally, we have Vivek Venkatesh, UNESCO co-chair in Prevention of Radicalization and Violent Extremism, Director, Center for the Study of Learning and Performance, Professor, Inclusive Practices in Visual Arts, Art Education, Creator, Grouposium, Director at Project Someone, co-founder of Landscape of Hate, co-founder of Landscape of Hate. Yep, Vivek Venkatesh is a filmmaker, musician, multimedia artist, curator, and applied learning scientist working at the intersection of public pedagogy and critical digital literacy. Formerly at Concordia University, Vivek served as Associate Dean, Recruitment and Awards at the School of Graduate Studies from 2017 to 2018. Was the Associate Dean, Academic Programs and Development at the School of Graduate Studies from 2012 to 2015. Inaugural Director of the Graduate Certificate in University of Teaching, and he was tenured faculty in the Department of Education, the Faculty of Arts and Science. He is a Doctor of Philosophy in Educational Technology from Concordia University. So after the panelists respond to the presentation, you'll each have about 10 to 12 minutes to offer your comments and thoughts, and then we can open to the question and answer period. And I'll be moderating the chat and the Q&A box so that we can have a really interesting discussion. So we could share the screen, and I'll give the floor to Jack and Ashley.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm going to kick things off first and let Jack follow. Today, we'll be providing a snapshot of data that we've collected in the last few weeks that complement the concepts of systemic racism and prejudice that were presented in the previous very enlightening session that we just had. So we'll be presenting the results of 2 rounds of web-based surveys that were conducted with our partner, Flegel, online in the month of June. We were able to get over 1,500 responses across Canada and the United States, and the respondents were of 18 years of age and older. So to jump right in, we found that when it came to feelings around systemic racism in Canada, Americans are more likely than Canadians to see this as a serious problem overall at 41%. And when looking at the belief that systemic racism exists among law enforcement as a serious problem, Americans and Canadians are pretty similar in their perceptions around this. Next, we're going to look at comments from friends and family with regards to our comments that have racist and prejudiced tones. So Americans are more likely to hear such comments about Black people at 34% from their own family and friends, followed by Muslims and immigrants, as we can see here. On the Canadian side, we seem to hear more negative comments about Muslims being passed among our family and friends, followed by Indigenous peoples and immigrants as well. When looking at similar comments being made in social media, Canadians are more likely than Americans to hear negative comments about immigrants, as well as Muslims and Indigenous people after that. And it's also interesting to note here that when it comes to seeing comments on social media about Black people in Canada and the United States, respondents indicated the same percentage. Now, when looking at overall exposure to racist and prejudiced comments, Canadians are more likely to be exposed to this in social media at 40%, more so than their American counterparts, while in the United States, they tend to be more exposed to negative comments from their friends and families, slightly more so, but it's still significant to note. Next, we're going to look at the regional breakdown of comments being made by family and friends. And we can see here that Canadians in the prairies are most likely to hear comments about Indigenous people among their family and friends, while Quebecers are most likely to hear comments of being targeted towards Muslims. And those in the prairies and in Quebec are also most likely to hear comments about immigrants as well, relative to anywhere else in the country, getting close to 40%. And it's also interesting to note that in BC and the prairies, as you can see here, prairies, 52% of respondents noted hearing negative comments about Indigenous peoples. And in British Columbia, the predominant target group seems to be Chinese Canadians within their own circle of family and friends. When looking at the regional breakdown of seeing such comments in social media, the Canadians in the Atlantic are more exposed to social media, to negative comments on social media overall on average, and Muslims and immigrants seem to be the main target of such commentary, and this seems to be across the board in Canada as well, except for 2 notable exceptions where we see in the prairies, 42% of respondents had noted seeing something negative online in social media about Indigenous people, and in BC, that of Chinese Canadians. Now, when we look at our American counterparts, we'll see that Americans, as mentioned before, are most likely to hear racist comments about Black people, Muslims, and immigrants as well. But when you look at the regional breakdown, we see that racist comments or prejudicial comments are being made about Black people, particularly in Midwestern Canada, as well as Muslims, both at 40%. When looking at similar comments in social media, Americans are most likely to see these type of comments being made about Black people as well as immigrants relative to any other group. And we can also note here that in the Midwest, the predominant negative comments being targeted at in social media are that towards Black people. Next, we have this simple crosstab to kind of highlight the fact that exposure to racist and prejudiced comments from friends and family generally leads to a belief that systemic racism is a problem, contrary to what may be assumed. Those who never hear negative comments about Black people are less likely to be aware of a problem existing within law enforcement, and this needs further study in the future. Similarly, the more often respondents report seeing racist and prejudiced comments about Black people in social media, the more likely they are to report that systemic racism is a serious problem that exists among law enforcement. Lastly, for me, before I pass it on to Jack, I just want to highlight here that Canadians feel that relations with police officers are much better here than when they compare themselves to the United States. And you can see this particularly so when they reflect on relations between the police officers and visible minorities, and 68% of Canadians say that, you know, we're better off here with regards to that, and 77% say that we are better off in Canada in terms of relations between police officers and the public. And now I'm going to pass it over to Jack. I'm going to mute myself and do the next slide. Jack?
My video. All right. Am I good? Does everyone hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. So thank you, everybody, and thanks, by the way, to June and to the first panel for all their thoughtful observations and comments. It was a very enriching discussion, and thank you, Ashley, for presenting the first half of the study. I'm going to go on to look at the section of the polling around trust and policing. And in this particular survey, which again was done by Leger, there is oversampling. It was done June 12th to 14th in Canada, United States. There's oversampling in Canada for persons identifying as Black and Indigenous, so that the sample Ashley described earlier, 1,500 nationally, is boosted by another 600 to 700 respondents, with about 300 identifying as Black and 300 Indigenous respectively. So Ashley, let's move to the first slide. Comparing trust in police services. So this is the overall percentage. We can see here that trust in police services is somewhat higher amongst Canadians and Americans. But over the past month, there's been a noticeable drop in Canada with regards to trust in police. In April of 2020, around the time we first began some of the polling relative to COVID-19 tracking, in which we included questions about trust of police, it was at 79%. It's dropped to 70% as of June 15th, which is, again, the results from the June 12th to 14th polling. Next. So breakdown of Canadians' trust in police services. There is a substantial gap in the trust of police services between persons identifying as Black in Canada and those who are Caucasian or white, with a total of over 30 percentage points as regards the gap, which we can see if we look at total trust, looking horizontally. For Canada overall, it's 69%. It was 70 when it was rounded. For those identifying as white, it's 72%. For those identifying Black, 39%. Indigenous, 52% in terms of trust in police services. So then we go down 2 rows. We see the total who don't trust police is at 57% for Canadians identifying as Black and 45% as Indigenous. Again, a substantial gap. And if we think about that in real numbers, we're talking about hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people combined from the communities that are describing themselves as most distrustful of police services. Next. Breakdown comparing trust in police services, a rough similarity in terms of Canadians and Americans as regards trust in police services in the two countries, 38 and 39%. So that, and again, a substantial gap with the white population in both countries, upwards of 25 points in terms of that gap. But for those who feel that Canada is doing much better, which the polling results suggested, that Canada is doing much better with respect to police services when Canadians are asked to compare themselves with Americans. When asking those persons who identify as Black, there isn't much of a difference in terms of trust of police services in the two countries. Next. So breakdown comparing trust in police services. Overall, Visible minorities' trust in police is higher in Canada than it is in the United States. So that's the overall Visible minority population. And we can see that it is higher in Canada than it is in the United States. So that's including the Black population, but also with the other groups that constitute Visible minority in terms of this survey work. Next. Comparing feeling safe when interacting with police. So we can see here that around a question that reads as, did you feel safe when you've had to interact with police officers? You can see that it is 75% overall in Canada, 64% in the US. So it's an 11-point gap amongst when comparing Canadians to Americans in that regard. Next. In terms of interacting with police, do you feel safe in terms of what Canadians identifying as Black are saying? They're divided on that issue, 43% yes, 43% do not. Rather, 43% do not, 43% do feel safe. Indigenous, it's 57% that do feel safe compared to 32% that do not feel safe. And for the white population, 78% do feel safe compared to 14% that do not feel safe. So again, very substantial gaps based on identifying with racialized communities or Indigenous peoples with respect to the extent to which people feel safe in their interactions with police. Next. Canadians feel safer interacting with police. Yeah. Overall, Canadians feel safer when interacting with police officers than do Americans, and there is an 11-point difference in terms of Canadians identifying as Black relative to Americans that do so, in terms of the extent to which they feel safe in their interactions with police officers. So again, more research needs to be done on the relationship between trust and feeling safe as regards these communities. The trust levels are about the same in terms of Black Canadians and Black Americans responses, but in terms of the interaction, Canadians that identify as Black feel safer, but still 43% do not. Next. Comparing opinions around police measures, and we did circulate a similar survey to everyone who participated in the web conference today, which we aligned with some of the questions been asked in the Let's go. Okay.
Oups, excusez-moi.
Ça va, il n'y a pas de problème. Vous pouvez garder les commentaires et questions.
C'est gérer les enfants et la conférence en même temps. On essaie de faire les deux.
Et ma fille ici, alors je sympathise. So back to the presentation. So there's a broad consensus on 4 measures: police officers wearing a body camera, increased training for police officers on relations with visible minorities, besides their usual firearm, equip police officers with non-lethal weapons, such as taser guns, cayenne pepper sprays, etc., and identifying possible suspects based on a person's skills. So in other words, racial profiling. On all those 4 areas, actually, there is a pretty broad consensus across all groups against racial profiling, for police being equipped with body cameras, etc. Where there are, next slide, Ashley, where there are some differences in terms of measures that are preferred as regards policing between different groups within Canada, it's the prioritizing the hiring of police officers and visible minorities. The population identifying as Black is at 79% favorable to prioritizing hiring of visible minorities. With respect to the Caucasian or white population, it's 50%, though there's a high percentage that say they prefer not to answer or do not know. And for Indigenous respondents, it's 61% that prefer that measure, that is to say, the hiring of police officers that identifies as minorities. As regards another issue where, again, there's a bit less of a consensus, it's with respect to police officers on foot patrol being asked not to have a firearm, or not to have a firearm, that is, where 58% of respondents that are Black support that measure, which is less supported by other respondents in the survey. Next. So that's it for the survey work. Let me say, did want to make a brief comment since I heard some of the discussion about multiculturalism in the previous panel, which I thought was interesting. And surely as Canada approaches its 50th anniversary of multiculturalism next year, in 2021, it'll provide an opportunity for us to have a really important national conversation on issues of multiculturalism. I must admit that I have an opinion that slightly differs about the issue. I see multiculturalism as something that permits us to affirm our identities while trying to participate in Canadian society. It's true that multiculturalism has not been successful in lifting a lot of obstacles for racialized communities, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that area. And unfortunately, we haven't used the time over the past 50 years to maximize the measures we need around multiculturalism and other equity measures to achieve success as regards inclusion. But my preference with respect to multiculturalism relative to other models, like the model in the United States, the melting pot as it's traditionally been described, which favors assimilation, or a French model, which is a Republican model where everyone is French except for those people who don't fit in, presumably, but you know, we want to mask or disguise their differences, and we don't want to collect any disaggregated data in Republican places like France. And or my home province of Quebec, where we say we don't like multiculturalism, we presumably like interculturalism. And yet, if you look at our nominations process in terms of who's in decision-making positions and who's in our civil service, I yesterday, out of curiosity, went to the nominations that are on the website of the Premier's office, and I suggest that some of you do the same thing. And after 30 years of active advocacy, trying to get change effected that many of us have attempted to do, some of whom are on this call, like my colleague Linton Garner, we still see in the roles and the nominations, if you go over the last 100, a very, very uniform group of people being named. And that's been going on and on indefinitely in a model that likes to dismiss multiculturalism as a concept and likes to bash it incessantly in some of the tabloid media, which sometimes in my home province reads like, if I may say, rubbish. So I would conclude on that particular note, and thank you all for your patience. Merci de m'avoir accordé le temps pour présenter les données. Et je suis à votre disposition si vous avez des recommandations pour des questions qu'on peut insérer dans nos enquêtes. Nous sommes toujours à l'écoute et nous désirons faire la lumière sur les écarts persistants entre les minorités les plus vulnérables dans notre pays et tenter à adresser les inadéquaties en termes de réussir une meilleure égalité pour l'ensemble de la population. Merci.
Thank you so much, Jack and Ashley. There are a number of comments in the chat that I will get to. I think what I will do is let our panelists speak first. I will say I'm not a panelist, but I will say that it is quite interesting, the data that you're revealing, the similarities between experiences in the United States and Canada, and how we like to think that they're, it's a very different historical context. And even in my own research, despite very separate, or believed differences in historical context, the similarities of Black people in the United States and in Canada, on a lot of markers of racial inequities, so criminal justice system, child welfare system, health disparities are actually quite similar. So I'm going to open the floor to our first panelist, who is to Robert Henry. I'll give you about 10 or 12 minutes to respond on your thoughts with regards to Jack and Ashley's presentation.
Sorry, this is a joint presentation with Alicia Clifford as well here, so we can actually get into some more comments and questions later on here.
Oh, okay, great.
So if
do
Alicia,
we want to open the floor to Alicia Clifford first? Okay.
I'll be speaking first. She's just going to put the slides up here, and we'll go from there.
Okay. So sorry, I didn't have the presentation, so I'll let both you and Alicia share your presentation, and then we'll have comments at the end.
Sure. So first of all, I'd just like to say thank you to the organizers for inviting us on here and everything else. I'm in the Department of Indigenous Studies, and one of the things I also want to say is I'm Métis, but I'm white-skinned Métis. So my experiences of anti-Indigenous racism in Canada is very different than other Indigenous people. And we're going to talk about this a little bit here in our presentation on the idea of just simply people identifying as a person of color or Indigenous, Black, actually can begin to skew the data as it comes out based on these experiences. So when we look at this on the first slide here, what I want to do is just kind of talk about the Indigenous experience in Canada, and that it is not what I've been seeing in a lot of the conversations, not just here in Canada and broadly in the United States as well, is this division that seems to be happening. And this is one of the problems that I see within white supremacy and whiteness in of itself, is the way in which it goes and divides and separates things into categories and to shift experiences and it shifts the blame or the experience away from whiteness itself. And we see this happening over and over again when we start looking at the experiences and we start putting data out there. For example, the first panels there were talking about the Black experience in Canada and the over-criminalization. Well, when we start looking at this as well within Indigenous spaces, Indigenous youth in Saskatchewan, where I am right now, we make up 86.2% of all those in the child welfare system, but only 7.7% of the youth in the province. When we look at incarceration rates, they're 63.5% of the incarcerated rate, and only 4% of the population. When we look at provincial incarceration rates, they're upwards of 80%. We look at remand. And then we look at the issues of COVID-19 that's been happening here, and the ways in which Indigenous bodies have been controlled are very different. When we're looking at the data sets that come in, I'm always hesitant to read them for particular reasons. One, what is it that the questions are asking? So who's created the questions and what is the intent of what's going to be happening? And Alicia's going to talk about this a little bit more here as we get into the presentation. But the idea of developing this sort of pan-Indigenous or the universal Indigenous experience becomes really problematic. Like I said, as a white-skinned Métis person, I'm put in category as being Indigenous, but at the same time, my experiences can't be equated to cousins of mine, friends of mine, family of mine, who are dark-skinned, brown-skinned within this, and the way in which they interact with police. When I'm walking through a store, I'm not watched as a criminal, as somebody who's going to be causing an issue. I'm seen as a dominant white. I have white privilege walking through here. So the only way that this can begin to, when we ask these questions about racism in Canada and that with Indigenous bodies who are white like myself, is if these individuals like myself, are we critical? Have we taken anti-racist training? Are we in anti-oppressive spaces where we can actually begin to be critical and understand the privilege that we have within here? And that. The other part that I have with these large surveys and web-based surveys is when we talk about policing and interactions in violence, are they actually getting to the individuals who have the most contact with policing or the most contact with that? When the work that I do with individuals at a community level, many of them don't have not just access to internet, but where they have to get access, but emails or the ability to do this, but yet they're the ones who come in the most contact with police and who have the most negative responses with police. So therefore, are we actually getting the experiences that we need to see in order to actually address this? The second part that I have with these ideas of addressing or what is racism across spaces is the continued need of white bodies and white people to validate Indigenous and Black experiences of racism. So what does it actually mean? So until, if we can just remove white people from the experiences of is racism an issue and all of that, I think we're going to see a whole bunch of different statistics that are popped up. And technically, those are the ones we should be going off. We shouldn't be going off of the experiences of white individuals. We shouldn't be looking at that in racism, because we'll always continue to do that. We would never ask or validate these sort of questions in relation to asking men, does patriarchy or misogyny actually still exist within society, and then try and have a minimal idea of women that are put in here at the same time. Like it just doesn't make sense, but yet we do this with race and racism. So from that, I guess what I'm just trying to say here within these data and experiences with police, and we're going to let Alicia carry on here, is that we need to start looking at what are the ways in which we can collect this large base data, because we do need it. It does help us begin to create understandings of different things. But how can we begin to create quantitative data tools that begin to take into the complexities of our communities without minimizing the experiences that are actually happening in there? So with that, I'm going to give it off to Alicia here, and we'll go back to it later on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Henry. So when we started kind of looking at this, reconstructing variables, I started looking at the data that we were provided, and we weren't sure. So what we started having a conversation about is with the idea of vague descriptions. So vague descriptions, the interpretations then become subjective based on the person who's undertaking that assessment. So this results in covert forms of racism, which are embedded within institutions, being obscured, which ultimately eradicates any systemic issues or hides those systemic issues that are happening. So an example, so we were talking about in this current data set where we looked at how they were constructing the no versus the yes. And in the no, there was rarely was put in there. So I'll bring up the examples next. So here are the examples. So Canadian exposure to racist prejudice comments from family and friends. The yes, no were the current totals, and rarely was included as a no. However, we started asking ourselves, what is our understanding of no? So no is not a determiner, which means not any. No is a determiner, which means not any. So if not any is the wording, then rarely should be moved up to that yes category. So otherwise, there's a hierarchy that dictates that some instances of racism are considered acceptable. So either it exists or it kind of doesn't. There shouldn't be degrees of racism because if it's being said regardless of the frequency, then the prevailing ideologies persist. So this also drastically shifts those numbers and the larger picture changes. So as is evidenced on this slide, you can see the numbers significantly jump. So if we break down the demographics by province across the country, as was mentioned in the previous presentation, the Prairie region has the highest numbers of racism for Indigenous peoples, Muslims, and immigrants. And this demonstrates like a direct correlation between the overt historical legacies of colonialism, but also the current contemporary mechanisms of settler colonialism that target, I speak from Indigenous populations perspective, specifically in the Western Prairie provinces. So then we did the same with the social media comments. So the numbers across the board significantly increase when you move that rarely experience up to the yes category. So it really shows a marked different picture than what would be projected if you just looked at rarely as being a no experience. So for data collection, what is it that we want to collect? And Dr. Henry kind of touched on this briefly. Others have touched upon it in the first panel where they were discussing about the need, nothing about us without us, as well as the need to engage with community and have their voices present. So while disaggregated data is necessary, questions arise about what to collect, for what purpose, and for whose purpose. If we're asking about racism and systemic racism, there's a need to define those terms. Otherwise, the answers may not actually be providing an accurate image about what's occurring. So did respondents understand what racism means? Do they understand that language? Was there a standardized kind of definition about it? And secondly, allowing people who don't have a critical lens to write up the data can be very problematic, and it leads to issues about ownership, control, access, and possession, those OCAP principles. Again, pointing to the first panel where they're talking about nothing about us without us, the need to include community members. So in that data collection, and especially in data analysis, that's key. So just as written text has become a validation of the truth, quantitative data has become the same. So finally, we kind of ask, whose truth is it that we should actually be hearing about or from?
Thanks, Alicia, for everything. And again, I just want to reiterate a couple things here real quickly before we go to the next panelist, because of the time that's going on here. One, when we talk about some things, so within Indigenous research across Canada, there are some policies that have been put in place. The one that Alicia did talk about there was OCAP, ownership, control, access, and possession. This is a policy that was put in place, but again, when we start looking at Indigenous policy, just the idea of indigeneity in Canada, because of the complexities and the levels of policy and relationships to federal, provincial, and the idea of status and non-status, OCAP gets seen as a accompanying blanket almost in a lot of communities and a lot of researchers, that all Indigenous communities have access to this. When the reality is OCAP is only designed for First Nation status and large data sets, such as the ones that are being collected here. However, when we look at the first panel that was talking about no research without us, for us, without us, this is something that I think Indigenous and Black scholars can really start coming together to engage in the construction of what does community engaged research actually look like? What needs to happen if we're going to be looking at systematic changes, especially in regards to research and research projects, looking at the tri-council level and even at provincial levels? What does community engagement actually mean? Is it just about talking to a community, or what is the level of inclusion that we need to start doing in order to make sure and validate the experiences that are going on here? And so when we look at this, it's ownership, control, access, and possession for the person who was just typing there, just to make sure. So with all of this, when we start looking at the data sets and moving things around, it's not that we're trying to mitigate the data. What we're trying to show is that depending on how you, what are the variables that you want to take into consideration and place them in, it allows for a different picture to be put in. And this becomes very problematic when we start looking at these data sets and where they're collected and who the individuals are, and the importance and need for multiple ways of seeing, but also the idea of I can't even think of the word right now because where I'm at. Intersubjectivities need to be brought in and understand that. So we need to understand race, class, age, gender all together in order to understand these sort of experiences. So with that, I'm just going to leave it back to Alicia. So thank you.
I just noticed in the chat that there was a question about how we change the variables. So when we looked at the actual data, so yes was coded as often and sometimes. So yes was coded as often and sometimes, and no was coded as rarely or never. So when we switched things, we moved the rarely up into the yes, because as far as our interpretation is concerned, once is enough. That means that you're experiencing it and that those ideologies can and will persist.
Thank you, Alicia. I really wholeheartedly agree with so much of what both of you presented, just in terms of needing to kind of come together and to look at how we can map onto some of the OCAP principles, because I think there's a whole area of, what are some of the ethical considerations in doing research that really need to be elaborated on and expanded on and understand, and to put very clear requirements on who, under what context, and how research gets done. So I'm going to open the floor to our next panelist. I'm not sure if there is a presentation that you have, Dr. Vivek Venkatesh. I'll let you share your screen and open us up.
Hi, Alicia. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. Yeah, I'm not going to slumber along the questions that have already been answered. I think that my esteemed colleagues on this panel and the people who have talked about the issues that we face conceptually and in terms of data have really provided a platform from which we can begin to have a discussion. But what I do want to do is caution us as researchers, as practitioners, as activists, as policymakers. I would like to caution us to not really fall into the trap of the echo chamber, wherein we like getting patted on the back by listening to opinions that are very similar to our own. I think that that if we are to engage in a form of social pedagogy that is more reflexive than inclusive, then I think we'll have a much better plan for tackling the issue of systemic discrimination. And I use the word discrimination very, very carefully because it's important as well to recognize that our administrative leaders, whether they're in politics, whether they're in public health, whether they're in public safety, are more and more urging their constituents and the people who have put them in those elected positions to speak out about the problems associated with the complex social, political, economic, and cultural factors that have steadily eroded the human rights orientation that we should be moving towards. So I don't think everything is rosy, and I don't pretend that everything is rosy. When I started Project Someone, which stands for Social Media Education Every Day, in 2014, and when we launched our portal in 2016, we were looking specifically to sensitize the broader population to the ill effects of hate speech. And through the myriad funding that we've received, our project has grown in terms of impacting international organizations. We now run a UNESCO chair on prevention of radicalization and violent extremism through Project Someone. And we work with several partners. To date, I think we've worked across 13 countries. Our website has had over 20,000 individual visitors. We've reached over 17,000 people through individual engagements, whether through concerts, through documentary screenings, through workshops. And yet, one of Canada's biggest shames, national shames, the treatment of our Aboriginal peoples, of our brothers and sisters in these communities, has to use a more French terminology, ça nous a échappé, in a very, very obvious way. And so the current discussions around systemic discrimination and focusing our conversation on magnifying the narratives and voices of those who we serve and who we should serve is of most import to the organization that I direct and that I collaborate on with a variety of stakeholders. I want to talk about one such initiative which we released last week. It's our 19th and most recent initiative, and it's called Profile. And this initiative was created with the collaboration of my colleagues at the Canadian Commission for UNESCO, who are co-hosting today's webinar. And you can check out the multimedia version of Profile yourselves on projectsomeone.ca/profile. La trousse est bilingue et je vous invite après ma conférence et celle des autres panélistes de me poser vos questions et d'entrer en contact avec moi pour pouvoir apprendre un peu plus. Mais pour le reste de ce petit discours, je vais continuer en anglais. Profile was designed specifically to look at the problem of profiling without necessarily getting into the politics and obtuse hand-wringing, if I may say, of what exactly the problem is. We know what the problem is. We struggle to acknowledge it, and and various of our leaders struggle to acknowledge it. So profile was defined that even through its name, through capital letters, we wanted to make sure that it addressed the questions that we are looking to address directly. We've designed this toolkit across 5 questions. We want to help define social and racial profiling. We want to talk about what the current situation is. So across Canada, what do we know in terms of publicly available documents? Some of my colleagues from the first panel were authors of some of the documents that we consulted and synthesized for the purpose of our toolkit. The most difficult sections for us to work on, but also for people to read and engage with, are the sections on unpacking. How can profiling be understood? And there isn't a better way to understand it, unfortunately, than by listening to how it affects people in communities. Through a series of interviews and a series of documentaries that my team filmed over the last 15 months, we've talked to communities that have suffered and people who have suffered from profiling. And we also talked to some people in hierarchies of oppression and power who have come to realize some of the problems associated with profiling and how sustained levels of education, sustained efforts at training and professional development have enabled them to realize how to overcome some of these systemic problems. And so you can watch those interviews and you can listen to some of the ways in which they're proposing ways forward. This section on unpacking is then followed by one on the impasse. Why is it so difficult for conversations, and why is it so difficult for solutions to progress? And here, I don't want to be glib about this, but why does profiling happen? And I think what we've determined through our research and through data analyses is that we're not talking enough. We literally are not talking enough about this problem. When people want to address the problem, we get into issues of definitions. To a certain extent, that's understandable. But to another extent, it's completely unacceptable that the notion of systemic discrimination is still denied by those of us in power. So we're not talking enough. That's a big problem. We're not doing enough. Again, I don't want this to remain glib, but what does it mean to create representation in broader society, in public roles of broader society? What does it mean to ensure that communities and the vast swath of communities, minority or otherwise, are represented in public life? We don't understand enough. We see this. We see this in interviews that are given by political leaders, interviews that are given by heads of public safety organizations. There's a claim that we don't understand enough about the issue, what causes it, and also how it may be addressed. And so our toolkit dives into this to ensure that these impasses don't stop us from proceeding to what we've found as some possible solutions. I'll end with a few comments from the stakeholders who we spoke with. And my comments on this can't do justice to their words, so I encourage you to visit our website and to listen to the video testimonies from them. There's 3 types of solutions that are proposed by our collaborators. There are solutions to build trust and communication, and that comes through sensitization and education. And this is important because there's a role that the media plays in creating space for these dialogues, and not to necessarily sensationalize the manner in which profiling is being portrayed in the media. So how do you sensitize without sensationalizing? How do you document profiling? And how important is it for us to demand from our public institutions to document instances of profiling so that when these data are made available, beyond just the perceptual data that we're talking about through surveys, we are able to then ask for meaningful action and meaningful reduction in numbers that pertain to discrimination. Carrying on with this, how do you acknowledge the existence of the problem, but also create spaces for some pluralism? Not everyone around the table, and I see there were 800 people who were at this conference, at this webinar, 500 odd here. And I'm sure that, without engaging in a relativistic discussion, we all have our viewpoints on what works and what doesn't work. But how do you create spaces for discussion so that we don't shout each other out, so that we don't cancel each other out just because we don't agree with each other? Right? How do you learn to disagree and allow for a percolation of perspectives? And how do you then think carefully about how to create processes and systems which can reduce instances of profiling? And so this is not particularly new, but through our toolkit, you'll be able to see how some of the approaches that are recommended from commissions like the Human Rights Commission in Ontario, like our colleagues at UNESCO, in terms of not looking at piecemeal or department level approaches, but looking at comprehensive approaches, talking about shared vision and terminology, but not treating those as a way of marginalizing peoples whose voices may be less loud. How do you empower change from within and ensure that interventions are led by stakeholders from within communities? And how do you progress on conversations about what it means to be engaged in the community that can be responsible for its public safety without necessarily speaking to police-led, criminal-led, securitization-led rhetoric? I'll stop there, and I thank the organizers of the webinar for this invitation. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much. I think you raised so many interesting points, questions that we really need to ask ourselves and take the time to answer. There's one last panelist that I did not introduce, so I will introduce them right now. Carl James holds the John Augustine Chair in Education, Community and Diaspora in the Faculty of Education at York University in Toronto. His scholarly interests include examination of how race, ethnicity, gender, class, and immigrant status, citizenship intersect and mediate schooling opportunities and educational outcomes of racialized and Black students. He has a forthcoming publication that includes Color Matters, essays on the experiences, education, and pursuits of Black youth. So I will give the floor to Carl James, and I will give you 10 minutes so we can have maybe a little bit of a discussion at the end.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me and inviting me.
Thank you.
I probably would be able to take shorter insofar as we can get some more conversation. Rather than going through some of those points, I want to comment on some things that I noticed and that we should bear in mind as we think about data and we think about systemic racism. And as we think about anti-Black racism, that's really right now in the media and what we're talking about. And some of the panelists earlier talked about it, and we talked about it, how anti-Black racism and how systemic racism finds itself, and at this time, it's is representing itself to us to grapple with in really significant ways. So as I listened to the presentation of the data and what we have, and of course, and we talked about some of the points about data. I thought about how data, and I think someone used the term earlier, how data can be used as a weapon or weaponized. And I like the idea of us referring to the data as sometimes being a weapon, and because of the weaponization of data sometimes, why we see racialized people, and Blacks in this case, who do not like the idea of collecting data. On the one hand, because they see data is useful, because it could become an advocacy tool. On the other hand, the fear of it reinscribing stereotypes and things that might constantly bring them in the eye of police, or in make it so evident for them in school, et cetera, et cetera. And I do a lot of work with students, student population, student data, and every so often it's how these students are seen based on the data that constantly teachers would use. So data is one of these tools that I think might lots of racialized people are ambivalent with. And that's interesting. Earlier we talked about multiculturalism, and notice when we think of multiculturalism, we think of culture and we think of ethnicity, and there's a tendency not to think of race. And when we compare the American context with the Canadian context, where in the American context, there's clearly a recognition of race. Race is operating in the lives of people. Racialization and racism is evident, and it would be admitted. But in the Canadian context, we tend to think of culture, but never think of how race informs culture. So when multiculturalism is established, it's talking about those people and talking about the cultures from which people come, but never think of the culture that race forces us to present and use. So therefore, now we're coming into the discussion of race and racialized culture. And therefore, the data, when we look at data, then the data must help us unpack how race is operating in the lives of racialized people and how race is operating in the lives of white people. So the fact that white Canadians might think it's okay, therefore, to have trust in the police, while racialized Canadians, Blacks and Indigenous people might not see the same level of trust with the police. We have to think of how race is. We have to think about race is operating in that way and influencing these things. The other important point I wanted to make is, which was significant for the data, is, and I think Robert talked about this, who collects data, who analyzes data, who interprets data. And sometimes we always think that, there's a truth to quantitative data that we accept. But the question posed obviously is informed by a particular experience. And who's setting the question, of course, is going to be the white person setting the question is going to have a different experience. And out of that experience might introduce certain questions. So we need to also think of bringing a more diverse group of people together to help us understand, interpret, and look at data. To first set the questions and interpret the data. And so if in going forward, then we just cannot see data as neutral, data as just simply with not having any impact that we would want, and data as not being useful for setting the stage for how some communities are disadvantaged in the Canadian context. So I think I'll leave it there and invite go for the question, because the fact is it's important to think of data and its usefulness, and I would really enjoy some of these further conversations that we can have around the significance of use of data in as we go forward. And one other point that I want, you see, I always wondered about why we don't have more extensive data, especially, like I work in university, I always wonder, why don't universities collect data of their students to understand who the students are, who the students are here, what are their experiences, and how might we respond to students? What don't universities want to know about their students? Why they don't collect data? And so that's always a bearing question. For places that want to be able to do well, how can you address things without having the information to be able to address? And so therefore the use of data is important, but at the same time, some colleagues of mine would say, now that we have the data, what are you going to do about it? And so the idea is we have to make some commitment to change the way we've been doing things in order to be able to respond to the issues of race and systemic racism that we're talking about these days. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carl James. So that is the last of our panelists. I think there's a unifying thread in all of the presentations that we've heard today. And so I would love to hear what some of your thoughts. We have time for maybe one question before we'll wrap up. I'm going to go through the chat, but if there's anything or any pressing question that someone may have.
Alicia, can I jump in?
Yes. Yeah, go ahead.
I'll ask Carl and Robert a question, if I might. Hope that doesn't trump anyone else who puts the questions on the chat box. We can get to them individually. Carl, I'm curious in terms of the point you mentioned about universities, and actually, Alicia, this question could be directed at you as well. In terms of the ethical guidelines associated with collecting information, setting questionnaires, when we face crises like the one we recently faced, what do you think is the capacity for universities to work quickly to address these issues, given some of the ethical guidelines that I'm not sort of questioning, that are needed for getting approval for designing polls, questions, and collecting data? So I direct that question to Carl or Robert or Alicia, both Alicias, or Vivek for that matter.
Go ahead, Robert, and then I come.
Sure. So one of the things, I really don't think that universities are set up very well in order to deal with these sort of pandemic responses right away, but we are slowly getting better. And I think part of it is that the outreach that a lot of community engaged researchers are beginning to do is work with communities where they're at, so that when something like this happens, there's already a process in place to go through. Because at the university, within Indigenous research specifically, there are categories within the ethics board that as soon as you hit Aboriginal population, it goes into a whole different sort of section and creates a different risk category that's going on here. And so one of the things that we're finding within some of the health networks that I'm a part of with the First Nations, the Networks Environments of Indigenous Health Research here in the province, was how do we actually engage in real time with communities, with what the communities are asking for? Because a lot of the times we're not in the community, like we're from outside the community. Even though I'm Indigenous and I do my work within the community, I don't know what's happening on a day-to-day or how to collect this information. And so I think what we need to start doing is to start developing specific policies or ways in which information can be shared differently during these sort of crises times, the pandemics that are going on here. This isn't to say that we bypass ethics and everything else. It's to say that if we're community engaged researchers, we need to be able to have a space in which our community can say, yes, we trust Robert to do this because he's done this X amount of times with our community. And these are the questions we like to do. So there's always a continuation of relationship building that's happening. So looking at it, what is the relationship? What is the respect, the reciprocity, the relevancy, and the responsibility that researchers have? And I think these are questions, if we're going to look at challenging systemic racism, challenging the way the universities are set up as these towers and power that are going on, we need to critically analyze and reflect on ourselves as researchers to say, how does this impact ourselves? And what is the role that we have in making our communities a better place, that we're not just a collector of information, that we are political agents as well within all of this?
I think also the university is going to have to get back to looking at the policies and programs that they've established and the time at which, and ask questions today, are they still relevant? Because remember, some of these policies, especially data gathering policies and so forth, were set up at a time when the university started to have differently. And the more the university goes into wanting people inside the institution to make more relationship with community, we're going to have to get back to ask some of those difficult questions. And what structural changes we have to make in order to be more responsive to community. So it just can't. You see, what's happening in many organizations, okay, we're going to diverse, like many universities talk about, yes, we're going to have racialized people, Indigenous people, Black, and so forth coming, but the system remains the same. But so how can you really be ready to really provide and accommodate the diversity that you want, while at the same time you're maintaining the system? So even with research, we'll have to start thinking, what should we be doing differently in relation to the work that we need to do?
Can I just say one thing off of what Carl just said there? What I think is really important and has come across, and in the questions that are being done on the idea of hiring minorities into positions and thinking that that's the way out of it, is that just because you hire somebody who's non-white into positions that are predominantly white controlled, and it was stated earlier, doesn't mean that change is going to happen, because those individuals may uphold the system themselves, or they may not see the importance of challenging those systems because they're benefiting from that system. So simply by having increasing Indigenous police officers or minority police officers into a field does not change the space in which it's done, which is what I believe what Carl was saying there, was that it doesn't change the space in which all of the research or policing is being done in. Rather, it emphasizes this tolemic sort of reconciliatory engagement to say, we're going to include you, but we're not going to allow any system change, and you're actually going to be the purveyor of the violence that we're going to continue on your communities, but you're going to do it onto the communities themselves. And so
I also want to pick up a point that you made earlier, Robert, about if you're going to look at gender and the issues of gender and gender being a barrier, you just do not do it all male. You're going to listen seriously to women and the barriers but yeah, well, in terms of universities too, sometimes there's no concerted effort really made to look at the racialized experiences and interpret that racialized experience without it being filtered through whiteness.
Yeah, I would agree. And I'll just say this, I think that's a big problem with, the equity, diversity, and inclusion language, that the universities have really adopted, is that it's not really looking critically at what does it mean, what does inclusion really mean for who, right? Versus a more kind of decolonizing perspective or understanding of the need to transform. So thank you, Jack, Ashley, Carl, Robert, Alicia, and Vivek for a very interesting discussion. And I'm going to give the floor to the organizers. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much to all our panelists today. And thank you in particular to this most recent panel for a really rich conversation around data and systemic racism. I think there's so much more to really talk about when it comes to the ways in which we think about data, how data is collected, and what data really means. I took particular interest in the conversations around the way we tend to assign validity to quantitative data and the need to, think about that more critically. So a big thank you to everyone on this panel for a really rich conversation.
Yeah, I want to absolutely add to affirm everything that Mohammed just said, and also add my thoughts in terms of how we collect this data and the importance of that and the process and what lens it is through, because that obviously will affect the result you get. So it's like a circle. We have to pay attention at every step of the game. There's another element too, of course, in communicating what this data means and resonating with people. You also need some personal stories. And so on that note, I want to make a reminder to everyone here, if you want to have more of these conversations, deep conversations about what identity is, what it is to be a racialized person in Canada, I invite you to our next conference, which is taking place next Monday on the 29th of June. It's called Stories of Hope, and it is going to feature people from all communities in Canada. Michaëlle Jean, of course, was one of the people that we mentioned earlier, the former Governor General. But I'm going to be co-hosting with Yolande James, former MNA from Quebec. We're going to have Minister of Canadian Heritage Stéphane Guilbeault, Senator Lillian Dick, philosopher Charles Taylor, tennis star Françoise Abanda, poet Desiree McKenzie, a whole range of voices, and young people as well, adding their views of what it's like to grow up in Canada, what Canada means to them, coming from the background that they do. So I invite you to do that. You can sign up on the ACS Facebook page, as well as the Association for Canadian Studies website, and you can register there. It's free, of course, and it's from 11 to 4, Monday, the 29th of June. So I hope to see you there.
Donc, pour continuer cette conversation importante, un rappel de notre prochain événement que l'Association d'études canadiennes tiendra le 29 juin, du 11h à 16h, pour aborder la question de la diversité et ce que cela signifie d'être Canadien. On va avoir des témoignages d'espoir qui vont mettre en vedette le ministre du Patrimoine canadien, Stéphane Guilbeault, et les voix d'un groupe diversifié d'étonnants Canadiens, dont le sénateur Lillian Dick, le philosophe Charles Taylor, la star de tennis Françoise Abonda et la poétesse de la parole Desiree McKenzie. Donc, nous espérons que vous pourrez vous joindre à nous pour cet événement extraordinaire et vous pourrez vous inscrire via le site web de l'Association d'études canadiennes ou la page Facebook de l'association.
And I think that's it for us, Mohammed. Our hosting duties are done. I want to thank everyone for watching. Thank you to all the panelists and have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup de votre participation et à bientôt.